Hello, my dear friends. Imagine for a moment that you are standing before a palace so vast and golden that it seems to have pulled the sun from the sky to wear as its own skin. You see sunlight catching on 1,000 golden windows, reflecting off a gate that looks like solidified light, and dancing across acres of impossibly green, manicured lawns. This is the Palace of Versailles, the envy of the world, the symbol of absolute power and unparalleled luxury. It is, by all accounts, a masterpiece. And you, with your 21st century knowledge of basic sanitation, probably wouldn't survive a week here. The sheer, magnificent, beautiful filth of it all would simply overwhelm you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support allows me to keep pulling back these velvet curtains on the parts of history that don't make it into the glossy textbooks. Now, find that perfect spot. Settle into your pillows. Imagine yourself standing on that grand, sweeping avenue leading to the most famous palace on earth. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking, and the sheer scale of the place is the first thing that truly registers. The approach to Versailles is not a simple driveway. It is an act of architectural pilgrimage, designed by King Louis XIV to systematically humble you. The avenues are wide, straight, and impossibly long, converging on the palace as if all roads in the universe led to this single point of power. With every step, the buildings grow, the details sharpen, and your own significance shrinks. You feel like an ant approaching a mountain of gold. You see the royal gate, a 100,000-liver masterpiece of black wrought iron and shimmering gold leaf, crowned with the royal coat of arms. It doesn't just suggest wealth, it screams divinity. It's meant to be the first test of your loyalty. Are you awed? Are you intimidated? Awed. That is precisely the point. The palace is a weapon of political theatre, and you are its target. As you draw closer, you can't help but admire the stone facade, the crisp, clean lines of the marble courtyard, the perfect symmetry that speaks of a mind-sun king's mind that has imposed its will upon nature itself. Everything is in its place. Everything is ordered. It is the physical embodiment of control. And it is breathtaking. You lift your head, breathing in the air, expecting it to be crisp and clean, perhaps scented with the distant perfume of the famous gardens. But that's not what you smell. At first, it's just a faint, sour note that you can't quite place. You might dismiss it as the smell of the city of Versailles that has grown up around the palace, or perhaps the stables where the king's thousands of horses are kept. It's a bit like damp, turned earth mixed with something sharp and unpleasant. But as you pass through the magnificent gilded gates and step into the first of the great courtyards, the smell doesn't just get stronger. It becomes a physical presence. It's an assault on your senses, a thick, cloying blanket of stench that seems to cling to the back of your throat. Your eyes are telling you one story, a story of immense beauty, of order, of divine right carved in stone and gold. But your nose is telling you another, far more primal story. It's the unmistakable, eye-watering odour of ammonia from stale urine, mixed with the deeper, fouler smell of human feces. The grand courtyard, this majestic antechamber to the home of the gods of France, is a toilet. You look down. The gravel beneath your feet is dark and patchy in places, stained by more than just rainwater. You glance towards the magnificent, column-lined walls, and you see it. The corners, the alcoves, the spaces behind statues, they are all discoloured, streaked with a dark, damp patina that doesn't belong. This isn't a freak occurrence. This isn't the result of one unfortunate accident. This is the sister, or rather, the result of a profound lack of one. You are standing in the middle of a paradox. A palace designed to represent the pinnacle of civilization is mired in the most basic, uncivilized filth. And the reason is surprisingly simple, born of a combination of political ambition and logistical oversight. When Louis XIV decided to move his entire court from Paris to Versailles in 1682, he wasn't just building a home, he was building a prison. a beautiful, gilded cage where he could keep his thousands of nobles close, distracting them with endless ceremony and ritual, preventing them from plotting against him back in their own regional power bases. The plan worked beautifully. He centralized all power in France under one roof. The problem was, that roof now had to shelter up to 10,000 people on any given day, nobles, their families, their servants, along with the palace's own army, staff, guards, and craftsmen. And this city-sized population was crammed into a structure that had been designed as a grand country chateau, not a metropolis. There was no sewer system to speak of. There were no public restrooms. The handful of latrines that did exist were primitive, poorly maintained, and nowhere near sufficient for the sheer volume of human traffic. So, where did everyone go? Well, you're standing in it. They went in the courtyards. They went in the hallways. They went behind tapestries and up against the ornate walls. The concept of hygiene as we understand it as scientific link between germs and disease was centuries away. Cleanliness was a matter of appearance. You wore clean linen, you powdered your wig, you drenched yourself in perfume. But the functions of the body were seen as natural, and the waste they produced was just an inconvenient, smelly byproduct of life. For the thousands of courtiers and servants milling about, the entire palace grounds became a vast, open-air latrine. The Sun King had built a monument to his own glory, a machine for manufacturing power. But he had forgotten to account for the very biology of the thousands of human cogs he used to run that machine. The result was this, a golden facade that shimmered in the sun, built upon a foundation that reeked of a fickle moat. You take a shallow breath through your mouth, trying to block out the overwhelming reality of it, and hurry toward the palace doors, hoping for some refuge from the stench inside. But as you step across the threshold, a cold draught seems to carry the smell with you, a ghost of the filth that whispers a promise. The beautiful illusion you've come to see is only skin deep. You push through heavy, brocaded doors, and the air inside is barely an improvement. It's warmer, certainly, thick with the heat of hundreds of bodies pressed together, but the smell is still there. It has just changed its character. The raw stench of the courtyard is now mixed with a cacophony of other scents, sweat, cheap tallow candles, wood smoke from the dozens of fireplaces, and 1,000 competing perfumes. It's a dense, almost tangible atmosphere. You are inside the great machine of Versailles, and it smells of humanity in all its unvarnished reality. You are swept along by a river of people. This is not the serene, empty palace you see in photographs. This is a living, breathing, bustling hub. Courtiers in silks and velvets rush past, their faces masks of intense concentration. They are on their way to an audience, or fleeing a rival, or chasing a rumor. Servants scurry along the edges of the crowd, their expressions carefully blank, carrying messages, trays, and, you notice with a slight shudder, the occasional covered chamber pot. The palace is a constant performance, and to stand still is to be irrelevant. So you move with the current, your feet echoing on marble floors that have been polished to a mirror shine by the passage of countless hopefuls and sycophants. You pass through the state apartments, a succession of opulent rooms named for Roman gods: the Venus Salon, the Diana Salon, the Mars Salon. Each is more lavish than the last, dripping with gilded carvings, hung with priceless tapestries, and covered in ceiling frescoes that depict the Sun King himself as a mythological hero. It's propaganda at its most beautiful, designed to overwhelm the senses and reinforce the message: you are in the presence of a god on earth. And then, you turn a corner, and the flow of people brings you to the entrance of the most famous room of all. You step into the Hall of Mirrors, and for a moment, you forget how to breathe. It is not a room. It is an experience. A corridor of pure light. On your left, 17 enormous arched windows look out over the immaculate gardens, flooding the space with natural sunlight. On your right, 17 perfectly matched arches are filled with 357 individual mirrors. At the time, mirrors of this size were astronomically expensive, a luxury beyond the reach of even the wealthiest kings. To line an entire 240-foot-long hall with them was an act of almost obscene extravagance. The effect is dizzying, magical. The light from the windows hits the mirrors and fractures into a million pieces, bouncing back and forth, creating a sense of infinite, shimmering space. The vaulted ceiling above you is a masterpiece of painted panels celebrating the glorious reign of the king. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small carriage, hang like frozen waterfalls, their pendants catching the light and scattering rainbows across the gilded statues and marble walls. This room was the heart of the court. It was here that the king would walk each day on his way to chapel, where courtiers would jostle for a glance, a word, a nod of recognition that could make or break their fortunes. It was here that treaties were signed and foreign ambassadors were received, their jaws slack with awe, their reports home, filled with descriptions of a palace that could only belong to the most powerful monarch in the world. This is the illusion at its most potent. This is the apex, civilization, a testament to what humanity can achieve. You stand there, lost in the glitter, feeling the immense weight of its history and beauty. You watch the reflections of the courtiers, their brightly coloured silks creating a kaleidoscope of movement in the glass. And then you notice it. In a deep window embrasure, partially obscured by a heavy velvet curtain, a nobleman stands with his back to the room. He is dressed immaculately in a powder blue silk coat, his white wig perfectly coiffed. He seems to be admiring the view of the gardens, but his posture is odd. He is leaning forward just slightly, his feet planted apart. Your 21st century brain doesn't immediately compute. But then, as your eyes drift to his reflection in the mirror opposite, you see it more clearly. The angle of the reflection betrays what his back conceals, and you hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible trickle. The sound of liquid spattering against the ornate wood panelling at the base of the wall. He is urinating. Here. In the hall of mirrors, a wave of disbelief washes over you. Not here. It's impossible. This is the most sacred secular space in all of France. But as you look around, your senses, now attuned to this shocking reality, you start to see the signs. You notice another courtier discreetly turning his back in a far corner. You see a dark, wet patch on the priceless parquet floor near a potted orange tree, the air around it thick with that sharp, familiar smell of ammonia. The reflections in the mirrors don't just capture the light and the glory, they capture the sordid little secrets, too. They show you the furtive glances, the quick adjustments of clothing, the sigh of relief. The why of it is a brutal calculation of ambition and biology. Imagine you are that nobleman. You have spent a fortune on your clothes, your wig, your servants, all for the chance to be here. Your entire life revolves around being seen by the king. Leaving the Hall of Mirrors at the wrong moment could mean missing the one opportunity you'll get all year to catch his eye. A brief absence could be interpreted as disloyalty or worse, irrelevance. And where would you go? The nearest designated latrine might be a 10-minute walk through a labyrinth of corridors, and it's probably occupied or too disgusting to use anyway. The chamber pot your servant carries is back in your tiny, sweltering apartment 2 wings away. But the urge is pressing. So, you make a choice. You find a corner. You turn your back. You relieve yourself as discreetly as possible, secure in 2 thoughts. First, everyone else is doing it. And second, a servant will be along eventually to wipe it up. It is their job, after all. The man in the blue coat finishes. He adjusts his waistcoat, gives his cuffs a little tug, and turns back to face the room. He melts back into the glittering crowd, his face a perfect picture of aristocratic composure. He has done nothing to compromise the illusion of his own elegance. He has simply contributed to the rot that lies just beneath the surface of this beautiful, dazzling, and profoundly filthy hall. The performance must go on, after all, and you realize that every surface here, from the polished floors to the perfumed skin of the courtiers themselves, is simply another mask. You follow the man in the blue coat, drawn by a morbid curiosity to understand the person behind such a casual act of desecration. He moves with an unearned grace, his high-heeled shoes clicking a confident rhythm on the floor. He joins a small group of nobles clustered near one of the massive windows, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur. You watch from a distance as he greets a woman, a duchess perhaps, judging by the weight of the jewels around her neck. He takes her hand, bows low, and brings it to his lips. But he doesn't actually kiss her skin. He kisses the air just above the back of her glove. The glove itself is a work of art. It is made of the softest, most supple kidskin leather, dyed a pale lavender to match the ribbons on her dress. It reaches halfway up her forearm, and the air around it shimmers with a faint, powdery perfume. It speaks of elegance, refinement, and a delicate sensibility. Like so much else at Versailles, it is a key part of the costume, a signal of status. Perfumed gloves were the height of fashion, an expensive accessory that told the world you were a person of leisure and taste. You can almost smell it from where you stand, a complex floral scent, probably a mix of jasmine, rose, and a musky base of ambergris. This fragrant cloud is your next clue. It's not just an accessory, it's a necessity. It's a personal defense system against the pervasive reality of this place. The illusion is one of effortless cleanliness, of people who float through these gilded rooms, untinted by the grime of the world. The Duchess, with her powdered skin, her perfectly coiffed hair, and her perfumed gloves, looks like she has just stepped out of a porcelain box. She is the very picture of purity. The shocking reality, however, is hiding right there on her hand, concealed beneath that expensive, lavender-scented leather. If you were to peel back that glove, you would likely find a hand that has not been properly washed with soap and water in weeks, maybe longer. The fingernails would almost certainly be rimmed with grime. The skin itself, pale and soft from being constantly covered, would carry the faint but unmistakable odour of stale sweat and accumulated dirt. The why behind this paradox is rooted in the medical beliefs of the time. The 17th and 18th centuries were dominated by the miasma theory of disease. Doctors and scientists believed that illnesses like the plague, cholera and influenza were caused by miasmas, bad air, foul smells and poisonous vapours rising from rotting organic matter. In their worldview, it wasn't the invisible germs on the Duchess' hand that were dangerous, it was the foul smell of the courtyard you just walked through. The logic followed that immersing the body in water, especially hot water, was incredibly dangerous. It was believed that hot water opened the pores of the skin, making the bather vulnerable to these airborne miasmas, which could then easily penetrate the body and cause sickness and death. So, bathing was rare. For the nobility at Versailles, cleanliness was a dry process. It was about what was visible, not what was microbial. You would start your day not with a shower, but with a toilet ski or dry toilet. A servant would bring a basin of clean water and a cloth. You might dip your fingertips in the water and perhaps wipe your face. You might rinse your mouth out with a scented water. But a full body wash was an annual event at best, often undertaken only on a doctor's specific orders. The primary method of getting clean was to change your linen. The white linen shirts and chemises worn under the magnificent outer layers of silk and velvet were what mattered. The belief was that the linen would absorb the body's humours and sweat, drawing the dirt away from the skin. A truly wealthy person demonstrated their cleanliness not by bathing, but by their ability to afford multiple changes of snow-white linen throughout the day. So the Duchess' body is likely unwashed. The man in the blue coat who kisses her gloved hand, also unwashed. His own perfumed gloves, resting on the hilt of his dress sword, conceal the same grimy reality. The perfume they both wear, a thick and oily concoction far more potent than modern fragrances, isn't just for pleasure. It is a form of aromatic armor. It's meant to create a protective bubble of good air around the wearer, a fragrant shield to ward off the deadly miasmas that were thought to lurk in every corner of the palace. Jasmine and rose in her gloves' perfume weren't just a fashion statement, they were a medical prescription. You watch them chat, their heads close together, creating a shared cloud of expensive, defensive scent. They are gossiping about a rival's unfortunate choice of waistcoat, their laughter light and tinkling. They are completely at ease, perfectly inhabiting the illusion of their own purity. They are clean because their linen is white and their perfume is strong. The idea that the real danger might be the invisible filth clinging to their own unwashed hands would have been completely alien to them. It's a staggering thought, a society that could build the Hall of Mirrors, but was terrified of taking a bath. The man in the blue coat moves on, and the Duchess raises her gloved hand to wave to another acquaintance across the room. The gesture is pure elegance, a picture of refined grace. But you can no longer see it that way. You now see the glove not as an accessory of beauty, but as a cover-up. It's a beautiful, fragrant lie, a piece of perfumed leather designed to mask a small but significant part of the filth that everyone at Versailles carried with them every single day. The stench wasn't just in the courtyards and corridors, it was on their very bodies, hidden away beneath layers of silk, powder and perfume, a quiet reminder that the glorious illusion was always just one layer deep. You leave the Duchess and her perfumed glove behind, letting the current of the court pull you deeper into the palace's heart. You are moving now towards the state apartments of the king, and you can feel a distinct shift in the atmosphere. The chaotic, almost frantic energy of the Hall of Mirrors begins to subside, replaced by a more rarefied, more focused tension. The air grows quieter, the crowds thin out, but the stakes feel immeasurably higher. Here, a misplaced glance or a nervous twitch can have real consequences. You are approaching the sun at the center of this gilded solar system, and the gravitational pull is immense. Your destination is the king's bedchamber. It is the most sacred room in the entire palace, the symbolic and literal center of the kingdom. From this single room, all distances in France were once measured. It is the alpha and the omega of courtly life, and to be granted access is the dream of every powdered and wigged courtier who has ever mortgaged their ancestral lands for a chance to live at Versailles. The daily ceremony that takes place here is called the lever, the king's official waking and dressing ritual. It is, without exaggeration, the most important social event of the day, a tightly choreographed piece of political theatre that reaffirms the king's power and the precise, unchangeable hierarchy of everyone beneath him. The illusion presented is one of unparalleled intimacy and honour. To see the king in his bedchamber, to witness him emerge from sleep, is to be admitted into the inner sanctum of power. It is a sign that you are not just a face in the crowd, but a person of consequence, a player in the great game. The room itself is a masterpiece of opulent propaganda. It is dominated by a magnificent balustrade of carved and gilded wood, which separates the main part of the room from the sacred alcove containing the royal bed. This railing acts like the altar rail in a cathedral, creating a space for the congregation of nobles and a holy of holies where the deity the king resides. The bed is a monumental creation, draped in cascading gold and crimson fabrics, surrounded by priceless art, bull marquetry furniture and personal effects that seem to hum with a divine aura. To be invited past the balustrade is to cross a threshold into a different reality. The ceremony is divided into a series of increasingly exclusive stages, and your rank determines which stage you may attend. First is the entrée familière, the family entry, granted only to the king's immediate family, a few of his most senior, physicians and some favoured companions. They enter while the king is still in bed. Then comes the grand entry, where the highest officers of the crown and the most powerful dukes are allowed in. Finally, the premier entry, the first entry, opens the doors to a slightly wider circle of important officials and aristocrats. Each group enters, bows, and takes its place, watching in reverent silence. The competition for these invitations is savage. Nobles would bribe, scheme, and ruin themselves for the privilege of being a silent spectator in this room for 15 minutes each morning. They jostle for the best position, a spot where the king might see them, where they might be chosen for an infinitesimal role in the proceedings. The highest honour imaginable is to be asked to hold the candlestick while the king gets out of bed, a task so prestigious it could make a man's career. You find yourself among the privileged few of the grand entry. The air is thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the palpable anxiety of men whose entire fortunes hang on the mood of the single man lying in the bed. The king, Louis XIV, finally stirs. His chief valet pulls back the heavy curtains. The king says his morning prayers, still propped against his pillows. The room is so quiet you can hear the soft rustle of silk as a duke shifts his weight. The first part of the ceremony begins. The king's wig is brought to him. He is given a small glass of wine mixed with water. The chief physician and surgeon enter, inquire after his health, and then discreetly exit. Everything is precise, ritualized, and deeply, deeply serious. And then, the moment arrives. It is the climax of this first, most intimate part of the lever. But it is not a crown being placed on his head, nor a scepter being handed to him. Instead, two valets approach, carrying an object that seems both ludicrously ornate and shockingly mundane. It is a chair, but not an ordinary one. It is upholstered in rich red velvet, the wood of its frame intricately carved and gilded. But set into the plush seat is a large, perfectly round hole. This is the king's chaise purse's pierced chair, his commode, his toilet. Beneath the opening sits a specially made pot of painted porcelain, sometimes even of silver. The valets place it behind a painted screen, though the screen does little to truly conceal it. Then the King of France, the Sun King, the most powerful man in the world, gets out of his magnificent bed, walks the few steps to this velvet-covered throne and sits down to have his morning bowel movement. You are standing in a room filled with the most powerful men in France, dukes, princes, marshals of the army, and they are all standing at attention, their expressions a perfect blend of solemnity and reverence, as they watch their monarch defecate. There is no privacy here. This is not a moment to be endured or ignored. It is the central, most honoured part of this morning's ritual. The act is called the selle, from the French word for stool, and to be present for it is the ultimate mark of royal favour. The silence in the room is broken only by the sounds of the king's biological reality. Your 21st century mind reels from the sheer, unadulterated strangeness of the scene. The contrast is nauseatingly powerful. The godlike king, the gilded room, the assembly of fawning nobles, and the simple, animal act of excretion being performed as a public spectacle. The smell, which had been masked by the competing perfumes, now has a new, earthy note that asserts itself with undeniable authority, a smell that no amount of ambergris or rosewater can truly conquer. It is the great equalizer, a reminder of the mortal biology that underpins even the most divine of monarchies. But why? Why transform this most private of moments into the pinnacle of public ceremony? The wiser stroke of political genius, a cornerstone of the absolutist system Laos had so carefully constructed. Firstly, it was a demonstration of total power. It sent a clear message. Every single aspect of the king's life, down to his most basic bodily functions, was a matter of state. His body was not a private vessel. It was the physical embodiment of France. Therefore, its workings were the business of the kingdom's most important men. There was no separation between the personal and the political for the king, and by extension, for anyone who wished to be close to him. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it was a masterful tool of control. It kept the nobility occupied with meaningless ritual. Instead of plotting rebellions on their country estates, the most powerful men in France were spending their mornings in Paris, angling for the honour of watching the king use the toilet. The competition for these trivial roles, passing the royal shirt after the selle, was another high honour, was fierce and all-consuming. It turned potential rivals into supplicants, focusing their ambitions on proximity to the royal body rather than on challenging royal authority. Laos fed them scraps of intimacy, and they fought over them like starving dogs, leaving them no time or energy to unite against him. Thirdly, it was an act of supreme confidence that paradoxically reinforced his mystique. By performing a humbling act in such a public and ceremonial way, Laos demonstrated that he was beyond being humbled. A lesser man would hide such things, but the Sun King's divinity was so absolute that not even this could diminish it. In fact, the ritual elevated his courtiers. They were not just watching a man on a toilet, they were participating in a state ceremony. Their presence validated his unique status. He was human, yes, but in a way so utterly different from them that his biology became a subject of state-sanctioned veneration. Adding another layer to this bizarre scene was the ever-present medical staff. After the king had finished, The pot would be taken away by a valet, but not before being presented to the royal physicians. The king's stool was a vital national health indicator. The doctors would inspect it closely for colour, consistency, and smell, looking for any sign of illness that could destabilize the kingdom. The health of the king's digestive system was, quite literally, a national security concern. This added a veneer of quasi-scientific purpose to the ritual, blending the worlds of courtly etiquette and medical examination into a single, surreal performance. This practice reached its apotheosis of public fascination years later, when Louis Ziv developed an anal fistula. The resulting surgery in 1686 was a national event. The court held its breath. When the operation was a success, the entire country celebrated. The lead surgeon was ennobled, and a new fashion trend even emerged, an anal fistula-style ribbon worn on the shoulder. This episode cemented the king's backside as a subject of intense public interest, and only further normalized the idea that the king's bodily functions were a spectacle for the court. As the king finishes, the pot is swiftly and discreetly removed. A valet hands him a linen cloth. He stands, and the next phase of the lever, the dressing, begins. The mood in the room subtly shifts. The tension of the cell dissipates, replaced by the eager anticipation of who will be chosen for the honor of helping the king put on his breeches or his waistcoat. You, as an observer, feel a sense of profound dislocation. You have just witnessed the raw, unfiltered source code of Versailles' power structure. It isn't written in laws or constitutions. It is inscribed in these daily rituals of bodily function and fawning proximity. The entire vast, glorious and filthy system of the palace is built upon this foundation, the complete erosion of privacy in the service of absolute power. The filth is not an accident. It is an instrument. The casual urination in the hall of mirrors and the ceremonial defecation in the king's bedchamber are not opposites. They are two expressions of the same central idea. At Versailles, the normal rules of human behavior have been suspended, and the body itself in all its glory and all its grossness has become the ultimate currency of power. You back out of the king's bedchamber, the strange, reverent odor of the cell still lingering in your memory. You need air, space, a moment to process the bizarre collision of divine ritual and human biology. You rejoin the main flow of courtiers, a river of silk and ambition that empties out from the royal apartments and into the grander, more public thoroughfares of the palace. You find yourself at the top of a monumental staircase. This is not just any set of stairs. This is the ambassador's staircase, or the escalier des ambassadeurs, or at least, it was. By the time you've arrived in the later 18th century, it has already been demolished to make way for new apartments for the king's daughters, but in its heyday under the Sun King, it was one of the architectural wonders of Europe. Imagine a staircase so grand it was a destination in itself. It was a theatrical masterpiece of coloured marble, gilt bronze and stunning trompe-l'oeil frescoes. As foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries began their ascent, they would be greeted by painted crowds of people from all nations, looking down from forked balconies, creating the illusion that the whole world was gathered to witness their arrival. The ceiling was a vast glass skylight, flooding the space with a heavenly glow. The entire experience was designed to awe and intimidate, to make any visitor feel that they were ascending from the mortal world into the realm of the gods. This was the grand entrance, the formal red carpet, the stage upon which the first act of many a diplomatic drama was played. It was the very picture of power, elegance, and meticulously controlled perception. But this grand staircase, and others like it throughout this palace, had a secret, less glamorous function. For the thousands of lower-ranking courtiers, servants and visitors who didn't have an apartment with a private chamber pot or a servant to carry one of these magnificent architectural features served a very different purpose. As you stand there, picturing its former glory, another, more pungent reality forces its way into your mind. You look down the sweep of a similar, though less famous, marble staircase nearby. You see a group of soldiers from the Swiss Guard, their red uniforms a splash of colour against the white stone, laughing as they descend. One of them pauses, turns to the wall in a shadowed landing between flights, and without a hint of shame, relieves himself against the marble. The grand staircases of Versailles were, for all intents and purposes, public urinals. The shocking reality is that these arteries of the palace, designed for dramatic entrances and the elegant sweep of fine gowns, were frequently fouled. The nooks and crannies under the stairs, the dark corners of the landings, the spaces behind statues, they all became magnets for impromptu relief. You can imagine the scene. A footman, run off his feet for 10 hours straight, has a brief moment between tasks. A junior courtier, too poor to afford a room in the palace proper, has been waiting all day for a fleeting audience that will never come. The biological need arises. There is nowhere official to go. So, you find a shadowy corner on a back staircase, turn your face to the wall, and hope no one of importance walks by. The why is, again, a matter of scale and neglect. Versailles was a city without a public works department. The sheer number of people overwhelmed the primitive infrastructure. There were no janitorial closets with bright yellow wet floor signs. The cleaning staff was large, but their primary focus was on the most visible staterooms, and their methods were crude. A servant might be dispatched with a sponge and a bucket to wipe down a soiled patch of wall or floor, but this was a reactive, Sisyphean task. The moment one spot was cleaned, another was being fouled 2 corridors away. The smell of stale urine became a permanent, inescapable feature of the palace's less trafficked areas, a scent that seeped into the very stone and wood. You start to descend the staircase, your hand hovering cautiously over the balustrade. You notice the marble is not pristine. It is stained and discoloured in the corners, the grout between the slabs dark and suspicious. You think of the ladies of the court, their enormous, heavy dresses sweeping down these same stairs, the sheer volume of fabric in their panniered skirts sometimes stretching several feet on either side offered a convenient, if undignified, solution to their own urgent needs. A lady, caught short between social engagements, could simply pause, her wide skirts providing a perfect screen of privacy. Aided by a discreet lady-in-waiting, she could use a small, personal pot called a bordelot, an elongated, gravy boat-shaped porcelain vessel designed for this very purpose, which could then be handed off to a servant to be emptied. But if no pot or servant was at hand, a quick crutch in a dark corner was not out of the question. The evidence would be quickly absorbed by the layers of their own petticoats, or worse, left behind on the marble floor, hidden in the shadows. This casual fouling of the palace wasn't seen as an act of rebellion or disrespect. It was simply a practical response to a logistical failure. It was part of the accepted, unspoken reality of life at court. The social rules were incredibly rigid when it came to etiquette, the correct way to bow, the proper way to address a duke, but unbelievably lax when it came to sanitation. This was because hygiene was a personal, aesthetic concern, not a public health one. As long as you looked the part, as long as your wig was powdered and your lace was clean, what you did in a dark corner was your own business. The responsibility for the mess fell to the invisible army of servants, who were seen as little more than human mops. You reach the bottom of the stairs and step into a long, vaulted gallery on the ground floor. This corridor is less opulent, the walls plain stone rather than covered in silk. It's a service corridor, a backstage area. And here, the smell is even more pronounced. This is where the servants walk, where the soldiers stand guard, where the lower echelons of the court exist. The grandeur of the upper floors feels a world away. Here, the filth is not a dirty secret hidden behind a curtain. It is the mundane, everyday reality. You see a puddle in the middle of the floor and instinctively step around it, not even wanting to guess at its origin. You see dark stains running down the walls from the floor above, evidence of leaks from the overloaded cesspits or perhaps just a particularly careless spill. The grand illusion of Versailles was a top-down, the fair. The closer you were to the king, the more effort was put into maintaining the glittering facade. The further you descended, both in altitude and in social rank, the more that facade crumbled, revealing the stinking, rotting core. The magnificent staircases were the perfect metaphor for this social structure. They were the conduits between the gilded heavens of the royal apartments and the squalid reality of the ground floor. And along their entire length, at every level, they carried the undeniable evidence of the 10,000 human bodies that the palace's architect had so majestically housed, but so poorly provided for. The dream of Versailles was only sustainable if you kept your eyes fixed on the frescoed ceilings above, never looking too closely at the corners of the stairs beneath your feet. You feel the need to escape the raw, unvarnished squalor of the service corridor. The air here is too heavy, too honest. You want to retreat back into the beautiful lie, to see this illusion again, if only to understand how it can coexist with this reality. You ascend another, smaller staircase, one meant for the residents of this wing rather than for public ceremony. As you climb, the air changes once more. The damp, stony chill gives way to a draught of warm air, scented with beeswax and wood smoke. The sounds of shuffling servants and clattering equipment are replaced by the muffled notes of a harpsichord playing in a distant room. You have re-entered the front stage. You find yourself in a long, richly appointed corridor. Here, the walls are not bare stone but are covered in sumptuous crimson damask, and the floor is a checkerboard of black and white marble. Doors line the hallway, each one leading to a private apartment, the most coveted prize in the Versailles game. To be granted an apartment within the palace walls was the ultimate symbol of royal favour. It meant you had arrived. It meant you were not merely a visitor to the sun's court, but a permanent planet in its orbit. The competition for these rooms was a lifelong obsession for many nobles. They would scheme, flatter, indent themselves for generations, all for the privilege of a set of rooms often small, dark, and freezing within these hallowed walls. A door stands slightly ajar, and you peer inside, a silent ghost in this opulent world. You are looking into the apartment of a duke, a man of significant standing. It is not a single room, but a suite, an antechamber for waiting guests, a main chamber for receiving them, and a small, private bedroom or chamber coucher in the back. The space is a jewel box of 18th century craftsmanship. The walls are covered in intricately carved wood panelling, known as boiserie, painted in pale blues and creams and highlighted with gold leaf. A priceless tapestry depicting a mythological hunt hangs on one wall. Its vibrant colours are testament to the wealth required to commission such a piece. The furniture is exquisite, with curved legs and ornate marquetry, the work of master artisans like Andrew Charles Bull. A delicate writing desk sits near the window, a silver inkstand neatly arranged on its surface. In the corner, a grand canopied bed stands like a small building, its heavy velvet curtains drawn back to reveal a mountain of pillows and fine linen. This apartment is not just a place to live, it is a theatre for the performance of status. The Duke himself is standing by the fireplace, dictating a letter to his secretary. He is the very picture of aristocratic grace, dressed in a brocade dressing gown, his wig off for the moment, replaced by a comfortable cap. The air is warm and smells faintly of his perfume and the burning logs. Through the tall, multi-paned window, you can see a stunning view of one of the inner courtyards. From up here, the squalor you witnessed on the ground is less apparent. The distance transforms the stained gravel into a textured mosaic, and the figures scurrying below guards, gardeners, servants, fellow courtiers look like pieces on a game board. This is the perspective of power, elevated, detached, and commanding. This room is a sanctuary of civilization, a bastion of refined living, a testament to an orderly world where everything and everyone is in its proper place. As the Duke pauses for thought, a servant enters the room. He is an older man, his face etched with a lifetime of fatigue, but his movements are practiced and efficient. He walks not to the Duke, but to a corner of the room where a handsome, lyre-backed chair is tucked away. It is another chaise purse, the Duke's personal commode, a piece of fine furniture designed to conceal its humble purpose. The servant bends down and, with a slight grunt of effort, pulls out a porcelain chamber pot from the cabinet beneath the seat. The pot itself is a lovely object, made of fine Swiss porcelain and painted with delicate blue flowers. It is, in its own way, a work of art, but its contents are not. The servant holds the pot carefully, his face a mask of professional indifference. The Duke does not even glance in his direction. This part of palace life is meant to be invisible, handled by a silent, human machine. You expect the servant to turn and carry the pot out of the room, to begin the long journey to whatever designated disposal site exists in the palace's lower depths. Instead, he walks directly to the grand window. With one hand still balancing the heavy pot, he uses the other to unlatch the window casement. He pushes it open, and for a moment, a blast of cold, damp air rushes into the warm room, making the candle flames on the desk flutter wildly. The distant sounds of the courtyard suddenly become sharp and clear. The servant leans out slightly. He takes a quick, almost cursory glance downwards, not to check for specific people, but more as a general, habitual precaution. Then, with a practiced, fluid motion, he simply opens the chamber pot. You watch in a state of suspended horror. For a brief second, a brownish-yellow arc streams from the gilded window of this magnificent apartment, catching the grey afternoon light before plummeting 3 stories down. It is a waterfall of human waste, a cascade of filth tumbling from the pinnacle of luxury into the public space below. You hear a faint, wet splat as it hits the gravel of the courtyard. The servant pulls his head back in, closes the window, and latches it securely, sealing the room once more in its warm, perfumed bubble. He wipes the rim of the porcelain pot with a cloth he pulls from his pocket, places it back in its velvet-lined cabinet, and retreats from the room as silently as he entered. The entire event took less than 30 seconds. The Duke has not moved. He finally finds the turn of phrase he was looking for and continues dictating his letter. The secretary's quill scratches on. The harpsichord from down the hall plays a cheerful burr. Nothing has happened. An act that would today result in a public health citation and a viral shaming video was, at the Palace of Versailles, simply the most efficient way to take out the trash. The why of this disgusting act is a brutal, unanswerable logic of architectural oversight and social hierarchy. Versailles, for all its visual grandeur, was a logistical catastrophe. There was no internal plumbing. No network of pipes to carry waste away from the thousands of rooms. The entire sanitation system of this vertical city relied on 2 things, the chamber pot and the servant. Every day, the 10,000 residents of the palace produced a staggering amount of urine, and feces estimates range up to several tons daily. All of it went into pots. Gilded porcelain pots for the dukes, simple ceramic ones for the lesser nobles, and crude metal buckets for the servants in their garret rooms. Once a pot was full, it became a problem. The official disposal sites were a handful of large, brick-lined cesspits located in the most remote corners of the palace grounds, often near the stables or the kitchens. For that servant in the Duke's apartment, the correct procedure would have been to carry the heavy, sloshing pot out of the luxurious suite, down the damask-lined corridor, down multiple flights of crowded staircases, the same staircases that were already being used as urinals, through the public galleries, across the vast open courtyards to a designated cesspit. The journey could take 10 to 15 minutes each way. It was a long, arduous, and deeply unpleasant task, with a high risk of spillage. And this servant would have to make this trip dozens of times a day, for every member of the Duke's household. The window, on the other hand, was right there. It was the ultimate shortcut, the path of least resistance. From the servant's perspective, it was a perfectly logical solution. His job was to get the filth out of the Duke's sight and smell as quickly as possible. What happened to it after it left the window was not his concern. From the Duke's perspective, it was even simpler. He didn't care. As long as his room was clean and his pot was empty, the method of disposal was beneath his notice. That was a servant's problem. This defenestration of excrement was so common that it shaped the very architecture and experience of the palace. The ground floor walls of the inner courtyards were perpetually stained, streaked with the residue of thousands of such disposals. The smell, as you experienced in the very beginning, was a constant reminder of the rain of filth from above. Walking through these courtyards was a gamble. While servants were supposed to shout a warning, the old city cry of Garda's Leah, or watch the water, they often didn't bother. An unlucky courtier stepping out of a carriage in their finest silks could find their entire outfit and their dignity ruined in an instant by a direct hit from a third-story window. This systemic failure reveals the core philosophy of Versailles better than any gilded hall. The palace was designed for appearances, for the view from the window, not the state of the wall below it. The comfort and convenience of the elite were the only priorities. The consequences of their lifestyle were simply pushed down literally onto the lower levels and the public spaces. The filth didn't just pool in the corners, it rained from the heavens. You look again at the Duke, now sealing his letter with a stick of red wax. He is a man of immense culture and refinement, living in a bubble of unparalleled luxury. But his civilized existence is maintained by a system of shocking barbarity, a system where the sky itself can become an open sewer. The beautiful apartment is not a fortress against the filth, it is the very source of it, the mountaintop from which the foul rivers flow. The cycle of life at Versailles is on full display. What is consumed in luxury upstairs is disposed of with brutal efficiency out the window, creating the very squalor on this ground floor that the nobles so desperately seek to rise above. It is a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of splendor and stench. You retreat from the Duke's apartment, the image of that ghastly waterfall of waste burned into your mind. You need to see the opposite end of the Versailles experience, not the disposal, but the consumption. The grand ceremonies of the court were not just about politics and proximity, they were also about feasting. The king's table was a cornerstone of his power, a place to display the boundless wealth and bounty of his kingdom. The ritual known as the Grand Covert was another piece of public theatre, where the king and queen would dine in full view of a crowd of courtiers. To be invited to eat with the king was a rare honour, but simply to stand and watch him eat was a daily event for hundreds of nobles. You follow the scent of roasting meat and baking bread, a far more appetizing aroma than what you've grown accustomed to. The smell leads you to one of the palace's grand dining halls, a room prepared not for the king's intimate grand covert, but for a larger banquet for visiting dignitaries and high-ranking members of the court. The illusion here is one of almost overwhelming abundance. The room glitters under the light of a dozen chandeliers. A long table, draped in a cloth of dazzling white damask, runs the length of the hall. It is laden with a truly staggering display of food and silverware. There are pyramids of fruit, glistening roasts of beef and swan, elaborate pies shaped like castles, and platters of exotic seafood. The sheer quantity and variety are meant to communicate a simple, powerful message. The Kingdom of France is a land of inexhaustible plenty, and its king is a generous, almost godlike provider. You watch as the nobles take their seats. They are a riot of colour, their silks and satins forming a human rainbow around the white table. Servants, dressed in immaculate livery, move with silent, choreographed precision, placing dishes, pouring wine from silver ewers, and anticipating every need. The scene is one of perfect order and refined taste. The guests speak in low, civilized tones. They use their forks, still a relative novelty for some, to delicately spear choice morsels. They dab their lips with fine linen napkins. This is the height of European culinary culture, a demonstration of sophisticated manners and an educated palate. It is a beautiful, delicious lie. As the meal progresses, however, you start to notice the cracks in this perfect facade. The eating is not delicate, it is voracious. Courses arrive in services, waves of dozens of dishes at once, laid out on the table for guests to serve themselves. The competition for the best pieces of meat is subtle but fierce. The Duke might use his own knife to saw off a large chunk of roast, his knuckles greasy. Another might reach across his neighbour to grab a prized crayfish, dripping sauce onto the pristine tablecloth. The manners are a thin veneer over a very basic, competitive hunger. And then you look down. Beneath the table, out of immediate sight, a very different kind of feast is taking place. As a nobleman finishes with a piece of chicken, he doesn't place the bone neatly on the side of his plate. He simply, casually, tosses it onto the floor beneath the table. You hear a soft thud as it lands on the marble. A moment later, a lady, having nibbled the meat from a rack of lamb, does the same. Her bejeweled hand makes a graceful little flicking motion, and the bones disappear into the shadows under the tablecloth. Soon, you notice it happening all around the table. Scraps of gristle, discarded shells from shellfish, fruit pits and gnawed on bones are being nonchalantly jettisoned to the floor. The beautiful illusion of the sophisticated banquet is being actively undermined by the diners themselves. The floor beneath this magnificent table is becoming a garbage dump, a carpet of bones and refuse. And this isn't considered rude or disgusting. It is, in fact, the accepted custom. The why of this seemingly barbaric habit is a holdover from a much older, medieval tradition of feasting. In the great halls of medieval castles, the floors were often covered in rushes or straw. It was standard practice to throw bones and scraps onto the floor for the dogs that roamed the hall. The rushes would absorb the grease and spills, and when they became too foul, they would simply be swept up and replaced. It was a practical, if not particularly hygienic, system. By the 18th century, the rushes were gone, replaced by magnificent parquet and marble, but the habit remained. It was a cultural muscle memory, a tradition so ingrained that no one thought to question it. The floor was simply where you put the things you were done with. As if on cue, the evidence of this tradition comes trotting into the room. A pack of small dog spaniels, pugs, and other pampered lap dogs, the favoured pets of the court scamper, their nails clicking on the marble. They dive under the table with yelps of delight and immediately set to work on the feast that has been provided for them. You hear the crunch of bones, the happy growls of possession, the skittering of a dog chasing a rolling piece of gristle across the floor. The dogs are, in effect, the room's first-pass cleaning crew. Their presence is not seen as a nuisance. It is part of the ambience of the feast, a sign of a relaxed and bountiful household. The servants, you notice, make no move to stop them. They step carefully around the dogs, continuing their duties as if nothing is amiss. It will be their job, after the banquet is over and the nobles have retired to the card tables, to sweep up what the dogs have left behind. They will come in with long-handled brooms and large dustpans, gathering the splintered bones, the half-chewed scraps and the general debris into piles, to be carted away to the palace refuse heaps. This practice tells you something profound about the mindset of the Versailles nobility. There was a fundamental disconnect between the aesthetic of the table and the reality of the floor. The world above the tablecloth, the world of shimmering silver, delicate porcelain, and refined conversation was their world. The world below the tablecloth was someone else's problem. It belonged to the dogs and the servants. This compartmentalization of reality was essential to their way of life. They could celebrate their own elegance and sophistication while sitting directly above a growing pile of garbage, because in their minds, the garbage simply wasn't part of their experience. It was invisible. You watch a duchess, a woman of immense grace and beauty, delicately sip her wine. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she sends a fish skeleton flying into the darkness beneath the table. A small spaniel pounces on it, with a happy yip. The Duchess doesn't even register the sound. Her attention is on the conversation, on these subtle political currents flowing around the table. She is performing her role in the grand theatre of the court, and the performance requires her to be completely oblivious to the sordid reality just inches beneath her silk-slippered feet. The sheer wastefulness is as staggering as the filth. The amount of food prepared for these banquets was always far more than could possibly be eaten. It was a display of excess for its own sake. What wasn't consumed by the nobles or thrown to the dogs was not necessarily saved. While some leftovers, known as the rests, were a perquisite of the servants, much of it was simply thrown away. The kitchens of Versailles were a factory of conspicuous consumption, producing mountains of exquisite food that would, in a few hours, become part of the palace's massive refuse problem. You look at the glittering, beautiful table one last time. You see the polished silver, the sparkling crystal, the artfully arranged platters. Then you picture the floor beneath it, a greasy, chaotic charnel house of bones and scraps, being scavenged by a pack of happy dogs. The contrast is a perfect encapsulation of the Versailles paradox. It was a place obsessed with presentation, but utterly indifferent to the messy consequences. It was a culture that could produce the most sublime art and the most refined etiquette. It saw no contradiction in dining like kings while living, quite literally, surrounded by their own garbage. The feast wasn't just a meal. It was a microcosm of the entire Palace-y beautiful surface built upon a foundation of discarded filth. Leaving the surreal scene of the bone-strewn banquet hall, you feel an urge to see the other side of the coin. You have witnessed the lives of the nobles, the gilded consumers and producers of the palace's filth. But what about the people who had to manage it? What about the silent, faceless army that made this entire impossible world function? The servants of Versailles were as essential to its operation as the king himself, yet their existence is a story rarely told, a reality deliberately hidden from view. You decide to pull back one more curtain, to venture into the spaces where the illusion of effortless grandeur was manufactured through endless, grueling labor. You find a narrow, unmarked door off a secondary corridor, a door that no noble would ever have a reason to open. You slip through it and are immediately in a different world. The air becomes cooler, damper. The light fades. The wide, marble-floored hallways of the state apartments are gone, replaced by a steep, twisting, wooden staircase, its treads worn smooth and concave by the passage of a million hurried footsteps. This is a servant's staircase, a functional artery hidden within the palace's walls, connecting the grand floors to the hidden realms above and below. You choose to climb. The staircase gets narrower and steeper with each turn. The air grows warmer, stuffier, thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, booking fumes from some distant kitchen, and the faint, acrid scent of lye soap. You pass small, windowless landings where mops and buckets lean against the plaster walls, which are bare and stained with damp. The silence of the grand corridors is replaced by a low hum of activity, the distant clang of a pot, a muffled shout, the scurry of footsteps in the passage above you. This is the engine room, and it is always running. Finally, you emerge into the attics. You are in the combles, the vast, cavernous spaces directly beneath the palace's iconic slate roofs. The glamour of Versailles has completely vanished. Here, there is no gold leaf, no silk wall coverings, no polished marble. You are in a forest of rough-hewn wooden beams, massive timbers that form the skeleton of the palace. Dust motes dance in the thin shafts of light that pierce through a few dirty skylights. The floor is rough, uneven planking, and crammed into every available space, partitioned by thin, often incomplete, walls of plaster or wood, are the living quarters of the palace's senior servants. The illusion of Versailles is that it is a place of infinite space and luxury. The reality for the people who served the court was one of extreme overcrowding and squalor. While the highest-ranking servants, the personal valets of the king, for example, might have a small but relatively comfortable room, the vast majority of the palace staff lived in conditions that would shock a modern sensibility. You peer into one of these attic rooms. It is tiny, no larger than a small walk-in closet. There is no window, only borrowed light from the corridor. A simple, straw mattress on a low frame is pushed against one wall. A wooden chest holds the occupant's few possessions. A bucket in the corner serves as a wash basin and, when necessary, a chamber pot. The heat in the summer under the slate roofs would have been unbearable, the cold in the winter bone-chilling. This tiny, airless cell was home, and it wasn't even the worst of it. Lower-ranking servants, footmen, kitchen hands, maids often didn't even have a room to themselves. They slept on shared pallets in larger, barrack-like spaces or even on temporary beds set up in the corridors or service areas where they worked. Their privacy was non-existent. Their personal space measured in inches. They lived and slept in the very heart of luxury, yet their own living conditions were worse than those of the peasants they had left behind in the countryside. And then you realize the full, horrifying implication of their sanitation. You are standing in the attics, at the very top of the palace. There is no plumbing up here. The cesspits are a 15-minute journey down, on the other side of the palace grounds. For the hundreds of servants living in these attic warrens, the trip was impossible to make, especially at night. So, what did they do with the contents of their chamber buckets? They did exactly what the Duke in his fine apartment did. They went to the nearest opening. They would open a skylight or a dormer window and dump the contents directly onto the roof. The iconic grey-blue mansard roofs of Versailles, a symbol of French architectural elegance, were constantly being showed with the excrement of the servants who lived just beneath them. The waste would run down the slate tiles, collecting in the ornate gutters and gullies. In dry weather, it would dry into a foul-smelling dust. In wet weather, it would transform into a stinking sludge that would overflow the gutters, sending cascades of filthy water down the pristine stone facades of the palace below. The endless streaks of damp and discoloration you saw on the walls weren't just from the nobles on the main floors. The filth was coming from the top down, as well as the middle out. The palace was being assaulted by waste from every level. It was a closed system of filth, constantly being recirculated. The nobles threw their waste into the courtyards, and the servants threw their waste onto the roofs, and it all trickled down the same walls, collected in the same overflowing cesspits, and contributed to the same inescapable, miasmic stench. You retreat from the attics, the image of those squalid, sweltering rooms a stark counterpoint to the Duke's airy suit. You descend the twisting staircase again, going down, past the main floors, past the ground floor, into the cellars and basements of the palace. Here, the conditions are even worse. This is the realm of the kitchen staff, the laundry workers, the men who tended the fires. The air is thick with smoke, steam, and the smell of rot. The floors are slick with grease and water. These subterranean corridors are a labyrinth of storerooms, wine cellars, and workshops. And this is where the lowest-ranking servants, the scullery maids and the turnspits, often slept, finding a space on a pile of sacks or a corner of the floor near the warmth of the ovens. You see a group of women working in this palace laundry. It is a scene from a nightmare. They are standing over huge wooden tubs filled with steaming water, their arms red and raw from plunging the endless supply of the court's linen into the boiling, heavy water. Remember the dry cleaning of the nobility, their obsession with fresh linen. This is where that obsession ended up. The servants were the ones who had to do the dangerous, wet work, immersing themselves in the very miasma-filled steam that the nobles so feared. They were literally washing the dirt of the aristocracy onto themselves. The sheer volume of laundry was immense, thousands of shirts, chemises, stockings and napkins every single day. The dirty water, thick with grime and soap, was simply bailed out and thrown into drainage channels that flowed, sluggishly, towards the palace's cesspits, adding to the toxic brew. The why of this stark division is the very bedrock of the ancient regime's social structure. Servants were not seen as individuals in the same way nobles were. They were functional, almost invisible. Their comfort, their health, their very humanity was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. Their purpose was to absorb the unpleasantness of life, to do the dirty work both literally and figuratively that allowed the nobility to maintain their performance of effortless elegance. The palace was designed to hide them. The hidden staircases, the attic rooms, the basement workshops, they were all part of an architecture of invisibility. The nobles wanted the results of the servants' labour with clean linen, the empty chamber pots, the polished force without ever having to confront the reality of the labour itself. These invisible servants were wading through the filth of Versailles every moment of their working lives. They wiped urine from the grand staircases. They carried sloshing chamber pots through the crowded halls. They swept gnawed bones from under banquet tables. They dodged the falling waste in the courtyards. They lived in squalor so that their masters could live in splendour. The beautiful illusion of Versailles wasn't just built on a foundation of stone and gold. It was built on the exhausted, invisible bodies of thousands of servants who lived and worked in the very filth the palace generated. They were the human sanitation system, the living, breathing, suffering infrastructure that made the impossible dream of Versailles a daily reality. To see their world is to understand that the palace wasn't just dirty. It was a machine that systematically concentrated filth and hardship in its hidden corners, all to maintain the perfect, pristine image at its glittering centre. You emerge from the servants' world, blinking in the comparatively bright light of a public gallery. The air feels cleaner, though you know it's a fiction. You're beginning to understand the palace as a layered ecosystem, a great coral reef of society where the most colourful creatures live at the top, oblivious to the scavengers and bottom dwellers who process their waste. As you readjust to the world of the nobility, you find yourself drawn to the very thing that defines them, their clothing. The fashion of Versailles was a language in itself, a complex code of wealth, status, and political allegiance spoken in silk, velvet, and lace. You focus on a young marquis, a man in his early 20s, posturing near a window. He is a walking masterpiece of the tailor's art, the epitome of courtly elegance. His coat is a deep emerald green, made of shimmering silk velvet, its cuffs so wide they almost reach his elbows. The coat is embroidered with elaborate floral patterns in silver and gold thread, the work of countless hours by skilled artisans. His waistcoat, visible beneath the coat, is a contrasting cream satin, also heavily embroidered. Lace, the most expensive fabric of all, froths at his neck and cuffs, so fine it looks like captured sea foam. His breeches are skin-tight, showing off a well-turned calf, and his silk stockings are a pristine white. On his head sits a powdered wig, its curls piled high and arranged with architectural precision. He is, by all accounts, perfect. He is a work of art, a symbol of the immense resources required to simply get dressed in the morning at the court of France. This is the illusion of immaculate, untouchable beauty. You feel a strange, anachronistic impulse. You want to reach out and touch the sleeve of that magnificent coat, to feel the texture of the velvet, to confirm that something this beautiful is real. You imagine stepping closer, your hand extended. You picture your fingers brushing against the deep green pile of the fabric. And as you do, you imagine something else. You imagine feeling a tiny, almost imperceptible movement under the surface. A slight tickle against your fingertips, and then you see it. A tiny, greyish-brown speck, no bigger than a sesame seed, moving slowly through the forest of the velvet. It is a louse. You recoil. In your imagination, a shudder of revulsion running through you. The shocking reality is that this beautiful, elegant, impossibly expensive outfit is almost certainly a thriving mobile ecosystem for a host of tiny, unwelcome guests. Lice and fleas were not a sign of poverty or squalor in the 18th century. They were a simple, inescapable fact of life for everyone, from the lowest scullery maid to the king himself. The marquis, in his velvet finery, is likely crawling with them. The why is a perfect storm of fashion, hygiene practices, and the nature of the palace itself. First, consider the clothing. The magnificent silks, velvets, and wools worn by the nobility were almost never washed. Water would ruin the delicate fabrics, fade the expensive dyes, and destroy the intricate embroidery. These garments were investments, sometimes costing more than a commoner would earn in a lifetime. You didn't just toss them in the laundry. They were aired out, brushed, and spot-cleaned, but a full washing was out of the question. A courtier would wear the same coat for months, even years. This meant that any pests that found their way into the fabric had a permanent, undisturbed home. The seams of the coat, the depths of the velvet pile, the folds of the lace, they were all perfect hiding and breeding grounds for lice and their eggs, known as nits. Second, remember the bathing habits or lack thereof. The unwashed bodies of the courtiers provided a constant, warm food source for these parasites. Fleas would bite and feed on their blood, leaving behind the small, irritating red welts that were a common complaint of the era. Lice would live in the clothing and on the body hair, also feeding on blood. While people did their best to manage the problem, their methods were largely ineffective. This leads to one of the most iconic and misunderstood fashion accessories of the age, the powdered wig. You look again at the Marquis' magnificent, white powdered coiffure. We often think of wigs as a purely stylistic choice, a sign of aristocratic formality. But they also served a crucial and rather grim hygienic purpose. To wear one of these elaborate wigs, a man would have to shave his head or crop his natural hair very short. This was a radical act of pest control. By removing their own hair, they eliminated the primary habitat for head lice. It was much easier to delouse a wig than one's own scalp. Wigs could be sent to a wig maker to be boiled, baked, and recurled, a process that would kill any live lice and their nits. The thick, greasy pomade used to style the wigs and the copious amounts of powder made from scented starch or flour also helped to gum up the works for any new arrivals, making it harder for them to move and breed. The wig was not just a fashion statement, it was a sanitary compromise, a way of outsourcing one's head hygiene. Women, who generally kept their long hair, faced an even greater challenge. Their elaborate hairstyles, often built up over wire frames and padded with horsehair, were even more complex than the men's wigs. These towering creations were meant to last for days, even weeks at a time. They were held together with a thick pomade made from animal fat and heavily powdered. At night, a woman might sleep with her head in a special silk bag to protect the hairdo and to prevent the greasy, floury concoction from ruining her pillows. These elaborate styles became a paradise for pests. They were warm, protected, and full of tasty pomade, and the occasional flake of skin. The aristocracy was in a constant, low-grade war with their tiny tormentors, and they developed tools to fight back. You can imagine the Marquis, despite his perfect posture, feeling a sudden, maddening itch on his scalp, right under the edge of his wig. Discreetly, he might reach into his waistcoat pocket and pull out a scratch-back. These were long, slender rods, often beautifully made of ivory or silver, with a tiny, carved hand or claw at the end. They were designed to be slipped under the wig to get at an unreachable itch without disturbing the perfect powdered facade. It was an elegant tool for a deeply undignified problem. Another fashionable accessory with a secret purpose was the flea trap. A lady of the court might wear a small, ornate tube, often made of ivory or wood, on a ribbon around her neck or tucked into her décolletage. Inside this tube would be a small piece of cloth soaked in blood, honey, or resin. The idea was that the fleas, attracted by the warmth of the body and the bait, would crawl into the tube and get stuck, allowing them to be removed and disposed of. It was a tiny, personal line of defense in an unending battle. Even the patches, the small black silk shapes that people wore on their faces, the mouches or fly, sometimes served a dual purpose. While they were primarily a fashion statement, used to send complex social signals depending on their placement, they could also conveniently cover up a pockmark from smallpox or an unsightly flea bite. You look back at the young Marquis. He has struck a new pose, one hand on his hip, the other resting on the hilt of his dress sword. He looks invincible, a portrait of youthful arrogance and perfect taste. But you now see him differently. You see the tiny, frantic war being waged in the seams of his velvet coat. You imagine the maddening itch under his perfect wig. You understand that his incredible beauty is a high-maintenance costume that offers a warm and welcoming home to a population of blood-sucking parasites. The filth of Versailles wasn't just in the hallways or on the floors. It was intimate. It was crawling on the very skin and in the very clothes of the people who believed themselves to be the cleanest, most refined beings on earth. Their silks and satins were not a shield against the grime of the world. They were just a prettier, more expensive version of it, a mobile menagerie teeming with the most personal and persistent kind of filth imaginable. You pull away from the image of the louse-infested Marquis, a profound sense of claustrophobia closing in on you. The air in these gilded rooms feels thick, recycled, heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale perfume, and the ghosts of 1,000 furtive bodily functions. Every beautiful surface you see is now suspect. The silk on the walls, the velvet on the chairs, the polished wood of the floors, it all seems to hum with a secret, unclean history. You need to escape. You need fresh air. You need to see a sky that isn't framed by a window that might, at any moment, become a conduit for waste. You make your way towards the back of the palace, towards the enormous glass doors that lead out onto the grand terrace. As you get closer, the oppressive atmosphere begins to lift. You see light, vast and unfiltered. You feel a draft of cool, clean air, what passes for clean air here. You push the doors open and step outside, and the effect is instantaneous and breathtaking. You have stepped out of the gilded cage and into a seemingly infinite world of green and blue. Before you lie the legendary gardens of Versailles. This is the ultimate expression of the Versailles illusion, an even grander and more ambitious project than the palace itself. If the palace was Louis's attempt to master society, the gardens were his statement of mastery over nature. For as far as the eye can see, the world has been rearranged according to the principles of geometry, perspective, and absolute power. You are standing on the Parto Dio, a vast terrace overlooking two enormous, rectangular pools that act as perfect mirrors, reflecting the sky and the magnificent facade of the palace. The view from here is one of the most famous in the world, a symphony of perfect symmetry. A vast central axis, the tapis vert or green carpet, a lawn so wide and long it looks like a royal road to the horizon, draws your eye outward. It is flanked on either side by a breathtakingly complex world of statues, fountains, flower beds, and meticulously sculpted trees. Everything is in its proper place. The hedges of yew and boxwood are trimmed into sharp, geometric walls. The trees are pruned into perfect cones and spheres, defying their natural inclination to grow wild. The flower beds, or parterres, are laid out in intricate, swirling patterns that resemble the embroidery on a courtier's coat. The landscape architect, Andlonitra, was not a gardener in the gentle, nurturing sense. He was a general, marshalling armies of trees and legions of flowers, imposing the king's rational will upon the chaotic earth. The message is inescapable. Just as the Sun King has ordered the unruly nobles of France into a predictable, revolving court, he has also tamed the wildness of nature itself. This is a place of serene, godlike control. It is pristine. It is perfect. It is a man-made Eden. You begin to walk, descending the grand steps from the terrace. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. The gardens cover nearly 2,000 acres. To walk from the palace to the end of the Grand Canal, that massive cross-shaped body of water you can see shimmering in the distance, would take you the better part of an hour. As you stroll down the main avenue, you are surrounded by a silent population of marble gods and heroes. Statues are everywhere, lining the pathways, rising from the centres of pools, representing tales from classical mythology that all, somehow, echo the glory of the French king. You pass the Latona fountain, a magnificent tiered creation that tells the story of Apollo's mother turning the rude peasants of Lycia into frogs and lizards for insulting her. It's a pretty story in marble, but also a chilling warning to anyone who might dare to challenge the authority of the royal family. Further on, you see the Apollo fountain, depicting the sun god himself rising from the sea in his chariot. It is Louis's own emblem, placed strategically on the axis so that the setting sun aligns with it, a daily reminder of the king's cosmic significance. On days of grand celebration, these fountains and dozens of others throughout the gardens would be turned on. The sight and sound of so much moving water, a scarce and precious resource carefully engineered to flow here, was the ultimate display of wealth and technological prowess. It was magic, a spectacle that left visitors speechless with wonder. But the true magic of the gardens, the part that the courtiers loved most, was hidden away from the grand, public avenues. To the sides of the tapis vert, hidden behind towering green walls of clipped hornbeam and beech, lie the bosquets. These are the secret groves, the outdoor rooms of Versailles. Each bosquet is a self-contained world with its own unique theme and design. To step into one is to leave the formal grandeur of the main garden and enter a more intimate, playful space. You wander into one of these groves. The sun is dappled by the leaves above. The air is cool and still. You might find a hidden grotto lined with shells, a maze of high hedges, or an open-air ballroom with tiered grassy seating and a marble dance floor. One of the most famous, the Salle de Bol, even features a waterfall cascading over a series of stone tiers, creating a permanent orchestra of running water where the court could dance and listen to music on warm summer evenings. These groves were the heart of the garden's social life. They were places for romantic trysts, for private conversations, for gossip and intrigue away from the prying eyes of the main court. They were designed to be enchanting, to evoke a sense of an idyllic, pastoral fantasy, a perfect, clean, green world where nobles could pretend to be shepherds and shepherdesses from some classical Arcadian dream. This is the illusion at its most seductive, a pristine, natural paradise, artfully constructed for pleasure and escape. You wander deeper into one of the more secluded bosquets, one whose hedges are particularly tall and dense. The sound of the main garden fades away. Here, it is quiet, almost eerily so. The air, which had seemed so fresh on the main terrace, begins to change. It's subtle at first. The clean, green scent of cut grass and damp earth is tinged with something else. It's a familiar, unwelcome sharpness. The smell of ammonia. The same sour note you first detected in the courtyards of the palace. Your eyes, now attuned to the secret language of Versailles' filth, begin to notice other signs. The ground here, in the deep shade of the yew hedges, is not a carpet of pristine grass. It is bare, dark, and damp in patches, despite the dry weather. The undergrowth looks trampled and unhealthy. You see a piece of what looks like discarded lace, soiled and half buried in the dirt. Your idyllic Arcadian fantasy begins to crumble. You follow a winding path that leads behind a marble statue of a sleeping nymph. The statue itself is a picture of serene, untouched beauty, but the space behind her pedestal tells a different story. Here, in this hidden, secluded alcove, the smell is suddenly overwhelming. It is the unmistakable stench of a poorly maintained public latrine. The ground is dark and muddy, and you realize with a jolt of revulsion that the mud is not from water. You have found one of the garden's unofficial toilets. A rustle in the bushes nearby makes you freeze. Two young abs, their black cassocks looking out of place in this green bower, are hastily adjusting their clothing. They see you, and for a moment, there is a flicker of shared, unspoken understanding. But there is no shame in their eyes, no embarrassment. They simply nod politely as they pass, as if they had been caught admiring the foliage. They melt back onto the main path, leaving you alone with the stench and the sudden, sickening realization. The secret fertilizer of the royal gardens wasn't just a metaphor. It was our literal, daily reality. For the thousands of courtiers who strolled these grounds, for the servants who maintained them, and for the tens of thousands of public visitors who were allowed in on certain days, these beautiful, secluded groves were the only available restrooms. The magnificent gardens of Versailles, the pinnacle of landscape design, the symbol of man's perfect control over nature, were also the largest, most ornate open-air toilet in all of Europe. The why is, as always, a simple calculation of logistics versus grandeur. Lentre designed a paradise, but he, like the architects of the palace, forgot to account for the biology of its inhabitants. There were no public conveniences built into the design. Not one. If you were a duchess strolling near the Grand Canal, a full mile from the palace, and nature called, you had two choices: face a 20-minute walk back to your apartment and its chamber pot, or find a convenient bush. The choice was almost always the bush. The problem was magnified exponentially during the legendary feats that Lois, Civ would throw. These were multi-day festivals of unimaginable extravagance, with fireworks, mock naval battles on the Grand Canal, theatrical performances in the groves, and thousands upon thousands of guests. The gardens would be illuminated by 100,000 candles. The fountains would all be running. The court would be at its most brilliant. And this massive, temporary population will have to relieve itself somewhere. The result was that every hedge, every grotto, every secluded corner of these magnificent gardens would be fouled. After a grand fete, the servants' first and most unpleasant job would be the grand clean-up, a stomach-churning task of trying to restore the gardens to a semblance of their former pristine glory. But this constant, informal enrichment of the soil had an ironic and unintended consequence. While the royal gardeners had their own official sources of fertilizer manure from the royal stables, compost from the kitchens, the sheer volume of human waste deposited daily throughout the gardens undoubtedly had a significant impact on their fertility. The urine, rich in nitrogen, and the feces, full of organic matter and phosphates, were, in a grimly practical sense, a blessing to the soil. The roses in the rose garden, famous for their size and vibrant colour, were likely growing in soil that had been unofficially fertilized for decades. The lawns of the Tapis Vert, so famously green, were benefiting from a constant, if unwelcome, source of nutrients. You can imagine the palace's head gardener, a man like the famous Lenatre, having a complex relationship with this reality. On the one hand, the filth and the smell would have been an affront to his artistic vision, a constant desecration of his perfect, geometric world. He would have dispatched his army of under-gardeners to clean it up, to rake it over, to cover the evidence. But on the other hand, as a practical man of the soil, he would have understood what all that waste was doing for his plants. He would have seen the results in the vibrant growth, the lush foliage, the brilliant blooms. The filth was both the curse and the secret ingredient of the gardens. It was the serpent in this man-made Eden, but it was also, perversely, the source of its unnatural vitality. The illusion of a perfect, clean, controlled nature was being nourished by the most uncontrolled, unclean, and natural of human acts. You step away from the nymph's soiled pedestal and look out through a break in the hedges. In the distance, you can see the grand, shimmering facade of the palace. You see the perfect, straight line of the Grand Canal. You see the beautiful, ordered world that Louis Siv created, but you can no longer see it as pristine. You now understand that the entire, vast landscape is a lie. It is a beautiful skin stretched thin over a foundation of filth. The courtyards stink because they are latrines. The hallways stink because they are urinals. And the gardens, the great green lungs of the palace, are the most beautiful and sprawling cesspit of all. You find a path that leads you back towards the main terrace. You walk past a rose bush in full, glorious bloom. The flowers are a deep, velvety crimson, their perfume heavy and sweet on the air. You lean in to smell one, and its fragrance is intoxicating, a perfect distillation of natural beauty. But as you pull back, your eyes drift down to the soil at its base. It is dark, rich, and damp. And you know, with a certainty that chills you despite the afternoon sun, exactly what has been feeding its roots. The splendor of the garden and the squalor of the court were not separate things. They were one, locked in a grotesque, symbiotic cycle of decay and rebirth. You leave the garden's secret, sprawling filth behind you, the scent of the strangely vital roses fading as you once again approach the great stone mass of the palace. The experience has left you with a sense of weary resignation. You have seen the filth in the courtyards, the halls, the staircases, on the very bodies of the nobility, and in the grandest designs of the garden. It seems to be an unsolvable, all-pervasive problem, a fundamental law of this universe. But a nagging question, a final glimmer of hope, pulls you back inside. What about the king? Not the Sun King in his ceremonial bedchamber, performing his biology as an act of state, but the later kings, the men who inherited this magnificent, rotting jewel box. Surely the apex of the system, the man for whom all of this existed, must have had access to something better. Surely, absolute power could buy a man a clean and private place to think. This thought becomes a quiet obsession, a quest for a single point of sanitation in a sea of squalor. You are drawn away from the grand state apartments, with their public ceremonies and crushing crowds. You seek out the other side of the royal life, the Petit's apartments du Roi, the king's private apartments. This is a world away from the Hall of Mirrors. To gain access here is a privilege far greater than witnessing the Liver. This is the inner sanctum, a maze of smaller, more intimate rooms where the king could escape the crushing weight of public life. Here, he kept his libraries, his workshops, his map rooms, and his private dining rooms. These were the spaces where the monarch could, for a few precious hours, attempt to be a man. The atmosphere here is hushed, almost scholarly. The scale is human. The rooms are still exquisitely decorated, with delicate boiserie and priceless furniture, but they are designed for comfort, not for overwhelming display. You drift through a library, the air smelling of old leather and paper. You pass a small workshop, where King Louis, a man more interested in mechanics than in monarchy, would indulge his passion for making locks and tinkering with scientific instruments. This feels different. It feels like a space of reason, of intellectual curiosity, of a world beginning to tiptoe towards the Enlightenment. The very existence of these rooms is an illusion of a different sort, the illusion of a private, modern self, separate from the public role. And in the heart of this private world, you find it. tucked away in a small closet, a cabinet de la chaise, is the object of your quest. It is the king's private toilet. And it is a marvel. It looks, to your 21st century eyes, almost familiar. It is an English-style water closet, a stunning piece of fashionable, cutting-edge technology imported from across the Channel. The apparatus is encased in beautifully polished mahogany, its wood grain glowing warmly in the soft light. The seat is smooth and shapely. The bowl is not a simple porcelain pot, but a finely crafted piece of ceramic, perhaps with a delicate painted pattern. Above it is a small cistern, and connected to the mechanism is an elegant handle of brass or silver. This is it. This is the exception. This is the one, single, solitary nod to the future of sanitation in the entire vast palace. You feel an almost giddy sense of relief. At the very top of the pyramid, cleanliness has finally been achieved. You imagine the king retiring to this little room, closing the door on the stinking, chaotic world of his own court. You imagine the simple, clean efficiency of it. A pull of the handle, a rush of clean water, and the problem is simply gone. Vanished. Whisked away by the magic of modern engineering. This toilet is not just a convenience, it is a statement. It declares that the king is a man of his time, a man of progress, a man who has transcended the squalid realities that govern everyone else. It is the ultimate symbol of his supreme, untouchable status. But you have learned by now to be suspicious of every beautiful surface at Versailles. You lean closer, your senses on high alert. The illusion is nearly perfect, but one detail betrays. The air. The air in this small, enclosed cabinet is wrong. It doesn't have the fresh, open-air foulness of the gardens or the ammonia sharpness of the hallways. It has a different kind of odour. It's a stagnant, concentrated, plumbing gone wrong smell. A smell of trapped things, of water that has sat too long, of decay that has nowhere to go. It's the smell of a beautiful machine that does not, in fact, work properly. And here lies the shocking, almost tragic, reality of the king's state-of-the-art toilet. It was a flushing toilet in a world without plumbing. It was a high-tech solution connected to a low-tech, or rather, a no-tech system. You examine the machine more closely, trying to understand its secret. The handle, when pulled, would release water from the small cistern above, and it would indeed flush the contents of the bowl away. But away to where? There were no sewer pipes running through the walls of Versailles. There was no connection to a city-wide waste management system. The away was a lead-lined wooden box, or a large metal pan, located either directly beneath the toilet in the room below, or sometimes even housed within the mahogany cabinet itself. The king's revolutionary flushing toilet was, in essence, just an incredibly complicated and expensive chamber pot. All the flush did was move the waste from the bowl you could see to a container you couldn't, washing it down with a splash of water. And that container, now a sloshing, semi-liquid stew of filth, still had to be emptied. Manually. A servant, a specialized plumber known as a fontainier or a designated valet, would have to access this containment box, haul it out, and begin the same long, disgusting trek to the cesspits that the lowest chambermaid had to endure. In fact, their job was arguably worse. A simple chamber pot was a manageable load. The king's toilet box was heavy with water, prone to splashing, and far more disgusting to handle. The why behind this magnificent failure is rooted in the character of the monarch himself, particularly Louis XVI. He was fascinated by mechanics and new inventions. He saw this English water closet not primarily as a solution to a sanitation problem, but as a marvellous new gadget. It was the 18th century equivalent of owning the very first, clunky, prototype mobile phone. It was about novelty, status, and the love of intricate machinery for its own sake. He was demonstrating his worldliness, his sophistication, his engagement with the scientific trends of the age. The actual, practical function of the device was secondary to the statement it made. The idea of a flushing toilet was thrilling. The reality of what happened after the flush was just another messy detail to be handled by the invisible staff. The problems with this system were catastrophic. The delicate mechanism of the flush, with its leather seals and primitive valves, was notoriously unreliable. It leaked constantly. A slow drip from a faulty seal could cause the containment box below to overflow, sending a creeping tide of raw sewage across the floor of the room below, or worse, seeping out from under the beautiful mahogany cabinet right there in the king's private closet. The smell would have been unimaginable. And then there was the clogging. The spend, the crucial plumbing innovation that traps a small amount of water to block sewer gases from rising back up, had been invented but was not yet perfected. The early models at Versailles were crude and had narrow pipes. They clogged all the time. Imagine the scene. The King of France uses his magnificent flushing toilet, pulls the handle, and nothing. Or rather, a weak gurgle as the water level in the bowl rises menacingly, the contents swirling but not disappearing. A royal flush has failed. What happens next is a small, frantic, and deeply humiliating drama. A servant is summoned. The fontainier is called. He arrives, his heart pounding, his tools in hand. He is brought into the king's most private space, a space he would never normally be allowed to enter, to confront a stinking, embarrassing, technical failure. The king is somewhere nearby, annoyed, inconvenienced, his royal dignity slightly undermined by his own malfunctioning gadget. The plumber now has to get to work. He has to manually unblock the king's toilet. He has to open up the mahogany casing, stick his hands into the foul, plonked pipework, and clear the obstruction, all while trying to maintain an air of professional deference. It's a task that is simultaneously a terrifying honor and a disgusting nightmare. When you compare this high-tech fiasco to the simple, low-tech chamber pot, the irony is crushing. The Duke's servant, who you saw blithely tossing the contents of a pot out the window, was part of a system that was disgusting, yes, but also brutally efficient and reliable. The pot never clogged. The pot never leaked. The king, in his pursuit of modernity and luxury, had saddled himself with a system that was not only just as reliant on manual labor as the chamber pot, but was also prone to mechanical failures that created a far more concentrated, contained, and nauseating mess. This single object, the king's private toilet, is perhaps the most perfect metaphor for the entire Palace of Versailles. It is a triumph of surface-level aesthetics over functional design. It is a symbol of immense wealth and privilege that ultimately cannot escape the fundamental, underlying realities of the world it inhabits. It is a beautiful, gilded machine, fascinating in its ambition, but ultimately broken, smelly, and dependent on an invisible army of servants to clean up its constant, inevitable failures. The king could sit on a mahogany throne, but he was still living in an age before sewers, and no amount of money or power could change that. He had the most advanced toilet in the world, but he still couldn't get away from the stink. In fact, he had just found a new, more expensive, and more complicated way to live with it. And so, while the monarch's own private moments were subject to such complex and often futile engineering, another class of resident at Versailles faced no such constraints, operating with a freedom that the king himself might have envied. You step out of the king's private apartments, the phantom smell of his failed flushing toilet still tickling your nose. It's a smell of ambition meeting a messy, inconvenient reality. You've now seen the full spectrum of human waste disposal at the palace, from the public desecration of the grandest halls to the private, high-tech failures of the monarch himself. But there was another class of resident at Versailles, a privileged group that operated almost entirely outside these human systems of filth and decorum. They were the pets. Animals were everywhere at Versailles. The royal stables housed thousands of the finest horses in Europe. The royal menagerie, a precursor to the modern zoo, was filled with exotic creatures from around the world: lions, elephants, ostriches, all living symbols of the king's global reach and power. But inside the palace itself, it was the lapdogs that reigned supreme. These were not working animals, they were companions, accessories, and furry four-legged members of the court, living lives of unimaginable luxury. You find yourself in the Queen's apartments, specifically those of Marie Antoinette. Her love for her dogs was legendary. She had a particular fondness for tiny papillons, with their distinctive butterfly-like ears, and for the stout, comical pug. These creatures were her constant companions, her confidantes in a court that was often hostile and bewildering. You enter a salon, a jewel box of a room, decorated in the height of late 18th century style. The boiserie is painted in pale greens and pinks, the furniture is light and delicate, upholstered in floral silks. A harp stands in one corner, a sheet of music left open as if the queen has just stepped away. The entire room is an illusion of feminine grace, a delicate, pastoral fantasy brought to life. It is intensely, almost overwhelmingly, pretty. On a gilded chaise lounge, nestled amongst a pile of silk cushions, you see one of them. It's a pug, its wrinkled face a mask of supreme contentment. He is fast asleep, emitting a soft, wheezing snore. He wears a collar of red leather, studded with tiny silver bells. This dog, whose name might have been Mops or Thisp, lives a life that a peasant farmer or even a palace servant could only dream of. He eats scraps from the royal tabber, not bones thrown on the floor, but choice morsels of meat and cake fed to him from the queen's own hand. He is groomed daily, his coat brushed until it shines. He sleeps not on a straw pallet in a freezing attic, but here, on a silk cushion in a climate-controlled room. He is pampered, adored, and utterly spoiled. As you watch, the pug stirs. He stretches, his little bells jingling softly. He hops down from the chaise lounge, his claws making a soft clicking sound on the polished parquet floor. He trots over to the corner of the room, near a magnificent floor-to-ceiling tapestry depicting the goddess Diana at her bath. The tapestry is a priceless work of art, the product of years of labour at the Golin's manufactory. Its threads of silk and wool create a scene of divine, classical purity. The pug gives the tapestry a cursory sniff. Then, he nonchalantly cocks his leg and urinates a long, steaming stream directly onto the priceless artwork. The liquid soaks into the thick wool, leaving a dark, spreading stain on the ankle of the goddess. The smell of dog urine, sharp and pungent, momentarily cuts through the room's delicate perfume. The pug, having finished his business, gives a satisfied shake and trots back to his cushion, circling once before settling back down for his nap. He has just defaced a national treasure without a moment's hesitation or a shred of guilt. And the shocking reality is, no one would have blinked an eye. The unchecked mess of these pampered pets was a simple, accepted fact of life at Versailles. The palace was their playground, and every surface was a potential toilet. Priceless Savonnerie carpets, their intricate patterns the pride of France, were routinely soiled. The delicate legs of gilded chairs were gnawed upon. The silk brocade of a duchess's dress was a tempting target for a muddy paw or a territorial marking. There were no pooper-scoopers, no house training pads, no stern commands of no. The dogs simply did as they pleased, and a servant was expected to magically appear and clean up the mess. The why behind this extraordinary tolerance for animal filth is a fascinating mix of affection, status, and the same social blindness you've witnessed everywhere else in the palace. Firstly, there was genuine love. For someone like Marie Antoinette, trapped in the rigid, unforgiving etiquette of the French court, her dogs were a source of unconditional, uncritical affection. They didn't care about court protocol. They didn't judge her Austrian heritage. They were simply warm, living creatures who loved her. Allowing them to run free was an expression of this affection, a small act of rebellion against the stifling formality of her life. Secondly, these pets were status symbols. Owning a rare, perfectly bred lapdog was another way to display wealth and refinement. The dogs were accessories, much like a jeweled fan or a pearl necklace. They were part of the performance of aristocratic life. To be seen with a beloved pug or spaniel was to project an image of sensibility and leisure. And because these dogs were so valuable and so beloved, their actions were largely excused. Scolding the Queen's favourite pug for soiling a carpet would be a far greater social blunder than the soiling itself. It would be an insult to the Queen. The hierarchy was clear. The Queen's dog ranked significantly higher than the servant who would have to scrub the carpet, and probably higher than the junior courtier whose apartment the dog might wander into. Thirdly, and most importantly, it loops back to that core Versailles principle, the compartmentalization of filth. The mess a dog made was, like the bones under the banquet table or the urine in the corner of the hall of mirrors, someone else's problem. A lady of the court would no more think of cleaning up after her own dog than she would of emptying her own chamber pot. That was what servants were for. The mess was rendered invisible by the owner's social status. They could see the act, perhaps even comment on it with a fond chucklier, "Fiffi, you naughty thing." But the consequence, the actual physical reality of the filth, was immediately relegated to the servants' world. This created a constant, low-level sanitation crisis that was layered on top of the human one. The palace corridors, already treacherous with human waste, were made even more so by the random puddles and piles left by the roaming packs of dogs. The smell in some of the less ventilated apartments must have been a truly staggering combination of stale perfume, human body odor, and the unmistakable stench of old dog urine that had soaked deep into the wooden floors and fabric walls. The servants, already overworked, were now faced with this additional, unpredictable cleaning burden. Imagine being a footman, rushing to deliver an urgent message. You're navigating a crowded hallway, trying to look composed and professional, all while keeping one eye on the floor, scanning for hazards. You sidestep a suspicious puddle near the wall, only to nearly trip over a sleeping spaniel that has decided the middle of the corridor is the perfect place for a nap. It was a daily, frustrating obstacle course. This culture of canine freedom extended even to the most sacred of spaces. Dogs were frequently present at mealtimes, as you saw at the banquet. They were present in the salons, where politics were discussed and fortunes were made. They were even, on occasion, present in the chapel during Mass. The line between human space and animal space had been almost completely erased for these privileged creatures. You look again at the sleeping pug, a perfect symbol of this strange, parallel system. He exists in a state of blissful ignorance. He is not bound by the crushing rules of etiquette that govern his human companions. He doesn't have to scheme for an invitation to the lever or worry about the cost of his silk coat. He has all the privileges of a high-ranking, noble, luxurious food, soft bedding, constant adoration, but none of the responsibilities. He is free to indulge his every biological whim, anywhere and any time, confident that the consequences will be swiftly and silently erased by a world of humans that exists solely to serve him. The casual filth of the pets reveals the Versailles mindset in its purest form. It demonstrates a world so hierarchical that even a non-human creature could be elevated above the vast majority of the people within it. The mess wasn't just tolerated, it was an indirect expression of power. The ability to let your dog foul a priceless tapestry without consequence was, in itself, a display of your own untouchable status. The beautiful, delicate salon of Marie Antoinette, a room designed to look like a shepherdess's dream, is in reality a perfumed kennel. The illusion of pristine, pastoral elegance is maintained only by the constant, frantic efforts of servants scrubbing away the evidence of the room's true, four-legged masters. The Queen could surround herself with the symbols of a clean, simple, natural life, but she, like everyone else in the palace, was living in a world saturated with filth. A filth she actively, if lovingly, contributed to, one puddle at a time. The palace was not just a home for the French court, it was, in a very real sense, the most luxurious dollhouse in the world. And this constant presence of animal and human waste, this thick, fragrant soup of decay, led to a medical obsession that would, in turn, add yet another layer of scent to the already overwhelmed atmosphere of the palace. The sharp tang of the pug's impromptu contribution to the Queen's tapestry lingers in the air, a tiny, pungent punctuation mark in the palace's long story of smells. You've become a connoisseur of stench, able to distinguish the ammonia of human urine from the gamier notes of a dog's, the sour odour of the courtyards from the stagnant plumbing smell of the king's closet. You've understood the social and logistical reasons for the filth. But now, you sense a deeper, more primal fear at work. The filth wasn't just an inconvenience or an aesthetic problem. For the people of Versailles, it was a mortal threat. You wander out of the Queen's apartments and back into the more public spaces of the palace. You find yourself in one of the antechambers, a room where courtiers would wait for hours, hoping for an audience. The room is crowded, stuffy. The fire roars in the hearth, even though the day is not particularly cold, adding to the room's oppressive heat. You watch a doctor, identifiable by his black robes and serious demeanor, speaking with a wealthy baron. The baron looks pale, his face beaded with sweat. He is complaining of a fever and a general feeling of malaise. The doctor listens intently, his brow furrowed. He leans in closer to the baron, but not to examine him. He seems to be sniffing the air around him, a connoisseur of a different sort. After a moment, the doctor straightens up and pronounces his diagnosis. The baron, he declares, has been exposed to a pocket of bad air, a dangerous miasma, likely emanating from the direction of the palace stables or perhaps a poorly drained section of the gardens. The cure he prescribes is not rest or medicine in the modern sense. His primary prescription is for the baron to immediately procure a new, more powerful perfume, one with a base of musk and civet, and to apply liberally throughout the day. He also advises the baron to burn juniper branches in his rooms and to avoid breathing the thick, soupy air near the ground floor after dusk. The illusion is one of scientific, medical authority. The doctor, a man of learning, is diagnosing a problem and prescribing a logical cure based on the most advanced medical theory of his day. The shocking reality, of course, is that the cure is as misguided as the diagnosis. The doctor is instructing his patient to fight bad air with more bad air. Or rather, to fight a perceived deadly smell with a smell that was believed to be protective. The entire court of Versailles was engaged in a constant, desperate, and utterly futile war against an invisible enemy they completely misunderstood. Their obsession with perfume, pomades, and scented powders was not just about vanity or masking body odor, it was a primary form of preventative medicine. The why is a deep dive into this terrifying world of the miasma theory. Before the discovery of germs in the 19th century, the connection between filth and disease was understood not through microbiology, but through olfaction. Sickness was believed to travel on the wind, carried in foul-smelling vapors that rose from any kind of decaying organic matter. A swamp, a stagnant pond, a pile of refuse, a graveyard, a cesspit, all of these were seen as sources of deadly miasmas. The stench itself was the disease. Logically, therefore, the way to protect yourself was to create a barrier of good air around your body. A strong, pleasant scent was not just a perfume, it was an antidote, an aromatic shield. This belief system explains so much of the sensory experience of Versailles. The sheer, overwhelming cloud of perfume that surrounded every noble was their personal biohazard suit. The perfumers of the age were not just artisans, they were quasi-apothecaries, blending ingredients believed to have powerful prophylactic properties. Ingredients like ambergris, a waxy substance from the digestive system of sperm whales, musk, a secretion from the musk deer, and civet, a paste from the glands of the civet cat, were prized not just for their rich, animalic scents but for their perceived power to cut through and conquer dangerous miasmas. These were the heavy artillery in the aromatic war. Floral scents like rose, jasmine, and tuberose were the pleasant infantry, providing a top layer of fragrance over the more medicinal base notes. A courtier's daily routine was a ritual of aromatic armament. Upon waking, they wouldn't just wash their face, they would rinse their mouth with a scented water, like the popular eau de melice, to purify the breath. They would dust their bodies with scented powders. Their wigs would be powdered with starch that had been perfumed with orange blossom or violet. Their clothing, which as we know was rarely washed, would be stored in chests with sachets of dried lavender and rosemary to keep it fresh and protected. And of course, they would apply their liquid perfume, dabbing the thick, oily liquid onto their pulse points, their hair, and even their handkerchiefs. One of the most curious accessories born of this theory was the pomander. This was a small, ornate ball, often made of silver or gold, with perforated sections. Each section would be filled with a different solid perfume or aromatic spicy cloves, cinnamon, ambergris, musk. A wealthy individual would carry this pomander with them, holding it to their nose whenever they had to pass through a particularly smelly, and therefore dangerous, part of the palace or city. It was a personal air filtration system, a portable cloud of safe air to be deployed in emergencies. When walking through the stinking courtyards of Versailles, a prudent noble would have their face buried in their pomander, breathing in the scent of cloves and praying it was strong enough to ward off the fever they believed was lurking in the stench of the stained gravel. The palace administration itself took the threat of miasma seriously. Servants were constantly at work, not just cleaning for appearance's sake, but for public health. They would burn fragrant woods like juniper and rosemary in the corridors, the smoke believed to purify the air. Huge braziers of burning herbs would be placed in the grand halls during large gatherings, a desperate attempt to fumigate the space and protect the assembled nobility from the miasmas generated by their own crowded bodies. The flowers that filled the palace rooms, trucked in from the gardens and greenhouses daily, were not just decorations, they were part of the air defense system, their fragrant petals doing battle with the ever-present stench. The irony is heartbreakingly thick. While they were going to extraordinary lengths to combat the smells, they were utterly oblivious to the true sources of danger. A nobleman would hold a perfumed handkerchief to his face, to walk past a Palavigna, but would then wriggle her from the parcel that was likely contaminated perceived from an imbus aspect. A lady would faint from the dangerous vapours in a crowded ballroom, but see no danger in eating an oyster that had been improperly stored and was teeming with deadly bacteria. They were fighting the shadow of the disease, not the disease itself. And in a perverse feedback loop, their very methods for fighting the miasma often made things worse. The obsession with heavy, thick perfumes added another cloying, suffocating layer to the already dense atmosphere. The smoke from the purifying fires filled the poorly ventilated rooms with soot and carcinogens. And most tragically, their fear of bathing, that dangerous act of opening the pores to miasmic invasion, meant that their bodies remained covered in the very microscopic germs that were the true cause of so many of their illnesses. The unwashed hands of a food preparer, the flea bite on an ankle, the bacteria in a cup of water, these were the real killers at Versailles. But they were invisible, undetectable to a medical science that was guided by the nose. You look back at the doctor and the baron. The doctor is selling his patient a bottle of expensive perfume, a fragrant placebo against a phantom enemy. The baron, reassured, buys the bottle, dabs a bit on his wrist, and breathes in the healthy scent of musk. He feels safer already. He does not know that the real danger might be the lice in his own wig carrying typhus, or the contaminated water his servant will bring him later, or the respiratory infection he is currently breathing into the doctor's face. The entire palace, you realize, is a monument to this profound and tragic misunderstanding. It is a world built on a sensory illusion. The visual illusion of golden splendor masks the reality of physical filth, and the aromatic illusion of perfumed safety masks the reality of microbial danger. They were trying to cure stench, believing it was the disease. They were fighting bad air with more bad air, all while the silent, scentless killers thrived in their water, on their food, and on their own beautiful, perfumed, and unwashed skin. This was the ultimate paradox of Versailles, a society so terrified of the smell of its own filth that it blinded itself to the true nature of the dangers that filth contained. You've traced the filth from the grandest courtyards to the most intimate boudoirs. You've smelled it, seen it, understood its social and medical context. You've seen it rain from the windows and bubble up from the garden soil. It seems as though you've reached the logical endpoint of this journey into squalor. But there is one final, terrifying layer to uncover. So far, the filth has been a surface problem, a stain on the marble, stench in the air. But what about the foundation? What lies beneath the glittering floors of this magnificent palace? Where did all that wasteth tons of human excrement, the greasy water from the kitchens, the foul runoff from the laundry ultimately go? You must now venture into the true underworld of Versailles, not the servants' basements, but what lies even deeper. You find yourself in a remote, functional corner of the palace grounds, an area no courtier would ever visit, near the vast kitchens and stables. Here, the ground is muddy, and the air is thick with a deep, primal stench that makes the courtyard smell like a rose garden by comparison. It's a smell of concentrated, anaerobic decay, a smell that seems to rise from the very earth itself. A group of labourers, their faces grim, their clothes little more than rags, are gathered around a large, iron manhole cover set into the ground. With a concerted effort, they heave the heavy lid aside. A wave of toxic, gag-inducing gas billows out of the opening, so potent it makes you recoil, your eyes watering. You have just been introduced to the palace's final secret, the ticking time bomb. That lay beneath everyone's feet. The cesspits. The illusion of Versailles is that it is a solid, glorious structure built on firm ground. The shocking reality is that the palace and the ground around it was honeycombed with a network of vast, subterranean pits designed to hold the liquid and solid waste of its 10,000 inhabitants. These were not modern, sealed septic systems. They were, for the most part, enormous brick-lined caverns, some as large as a small ballroom. Into these pits flowed everything. Waste from the few permanent latrines, the contents of the thousands of chamber pots that were correctly emptied, the effluent from the kitchens, the lie-heavy water from the laundries, it all ended up here, in these immense underground stomachs. These cesspits were the end of the line, the palace's dark secret. And they were a catastrophic failure. They were designed based on the flawed assumption that the liquid waste would slowly seep away into the surrounding soil, leaving only the solid sludge to be periodically cleaned out. But the sheer, unrelenting volume of waste produced by the court completely overwhelmed this passive system. The soil around the pits quickly became saturated, unable to absorb any more liquid. The pits filled up, and kept filling. The job of emptying these pits was, without question, the most dangerous, disgusting and despised job in all of France. The men who did this work were called vidangers, or emptiers. They were social outcasts, men who lived on the absolute fringes of society, their profession so foul that they were often forbidden from living within city limits. When a cesspit at Versailles became dangerously full, these men would be summoned. They would work at night, by the flickering light of torches, to minimize the offense to the palace's residents. Their work was brutally simple. They would lower ladders down into the toxic abyss and descend into the sludge, which could be several feet deep. Armed with buckets and shovels, they would manually scoop the thick, noxious slurry into larger tubs, which would then be hoisted to the surface and carted away to be used as fertilizer on outlying farms. The dangers were immense. The primary threat was asphyxiation. The decaying waste produced a cocktail of poisonous gases: methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and carbon dioxide. This mixture, known as l'plomb by the workers for its heavy, lead-like effect, was a silent killer. The vidanger could be overcome in seconds, losing consciousness and drowning in the very filth he was meant to be clearing. The risk was so well known that they would often lower a candle into the pit first. If the flame went out, the air was unbreathable. They worked in short shifts, with ropes tied around their chests so their companions on the surface could haul them up if they collapsed. The mortality rate for this profession was staggeringly high. They were, in a very real sense, sacrificing their lives to deal with the consequences of the court's luxury. But the cesspits posed a much larger, more insidious threat to the palace itself. Because they were so frequently overflowing, they leaked. The toxic, bacteria-laden sludge would seep out through cracks in the brickwork, contaminating the groundwater for miles around. The wells that supplied the palace kitchens and the servants' quarters with drinking water were almost certainly polluted by this seepage, creating a perfect vector for diseases like typhoid and cholera. The nobility, who often drank wine or water imported from cleaner sources, were partially protected, but the servants, drinking from the palace wells, were constantly exposed to a slow poison. The leaking cesspits also threatened the very foundations of the palace. The constant saturation of the ground with corrosive liquid waste began to erode the mortar and stone of the building's foundations. The cellars and basements of the palace were perpetually damp, the walls slick with a foul-smelling slime. There are accounts of floors in the ground-level apartments becoming so saturated with moisture from the overflowing cesspits below that they would buckle and rot. Imagine being a minor courtier who had finally secured a coveted ground-floor apartment, only to find the walls weeping a stinking liquid and the floorboards swelling with filth from below. The problem became a full-blown crisis in the 1760s, during the reign of Louis. The stench rising from the ground itself became unbearable, permeating even the most luxurious royal apartments. The land around the palace had become a giant, toxic sponge. The situation was so dire that it was declared a public health emergency. The king and his chief architect, Ange Jacques Gabriel, were forced to confront the stinking reality that their glorious palace was in danger of being consumed by its own filth from below. A massive, incredibly expensive, and disruptive project was undertaken to try and fix the problem. No. More modern cesspits were dug further away from the palace. An attempt was made to create a more effective drainage system, with stone-lined channels designed to carry the worst of the waste away. But it was a case of too little, too late. The sheer scale of the problem was beyond the capabilities of 18th century engineering. They were essentially putting a bandage on a festering wound. They could move the filth around, but they couldn't make it disappear. This hidden, subterranean crisis is the ultimate symbol of the Versailles paradox. The entire glittering edifaceth hall of mirrors, the opulent bedchambers, the perfectly manicured gardens was built on a foundation that was literally rotting. The political and social structure of the ancient regime, with its glittering surface and its oppressed, invisible underclass, was mirrored perfectly in the palace's architecture. The beautiful facade and a toxic, crumbling foundation. The nobles could powder their wigs and perfume there, the loves, trying to create an illusion of purity, but they could not escape the fact that they were living, breathing, and dancing directly on top of a ticking time bomb of their own making. The story of the cesspits is the story of a system that had become unsustainable. It was producing more waste both literally and metaphorically than it could process. The attempts to fix the problem were superficial, failing to address the fundamental design flaw. Eventually, a system that cannot deal with its own waste will collapse. The cesspits of Versailles were a potent, physical omen of the revolution that was to come. The stench rising from the ground wasn't just the smell of decay, it was the smell of a system rotting from the inside out, a warning that the beautiful illusion could not be maintained forever. The pressure was building, both in the cesspits below and in the society above, and sooner or later, something was going to give. You pull back from the abyss of the cesspits. There's knowledge of that deep, foundational rot settling into you like a chill. You have journeyed through every layer of Versailles filth, from the casual to the ceremonial, from the intimate to the infrastructural. The entire palace now seems to you like a magnificent, beautiful, and terminally ill patient, its glorious exterior belying the systemic disease consuming it from within. The stench of decay, you now understand, was not just a smell, it was a symptom of a world on the brink of collapse. It feels as though this cycle of splendor and squalor is unbreakable, a permanent condition of this place. But history is never static. Even in this world so resistant to change, the first, faint breezes of a new era were beginning to stir. The agent of this change, ironically, was the person often blamed for the final excesses of the monarchy, Queen Marie Antoinette. You find yourself drawn back to her private domain, not to the grand state apartments where she performed her public duties as queen, but to her personal retreat, the Petit Trianon. This small, exquisite chateau, located a mile or so from the main palace, was a gift from her husband, Louis Sivai. It was her escape, her sanctuary, her attempt to create a world on her own terms, far from the suffocating etiquette and the ever-present filth of the main court. As you approach the Petit Trianon, the difference is palpable. The scale is intimate, human. The architecture is elegant but restrained, a masterpiece of neoclassical grace. The illusion here is not one of overwhelming power, but of private, domestic bliss. This was a place where the queen could shed her public persona and pretend to be a simple country lady. Surrounding the chateau are not the rigid, geometric gardens of Longchamp, but a more romantic English-style landscape with winding paths, gentle hills and artfully placed groves of trees. It is a world designed to look natural, unplanned, and most importantly, clean. You step inside the Petit Trianon, and the contrast with the main palace is staggering. The rooms are bright, airy, and flooded with light. The colour palette is soft pale blues, lilacs, and whites. But the most revolutionary thing is not what you see, but what you don't smell. The air is clean, truly clean. There is no heavy, cloying perfume trying to mask an underlying foulness. There is no sharp tang of ammonia from a dark corner. There is no musty odor of damp and decay. It just smells fresh. Here, in her own private kingdom, Marie Antoinette began to champion a radical new idea, the concept of personal comfort and modern hygiene. She was a product of the Austrian court, which was in many ways more advanced in its sanitary habits than the French. She was also a woman of her time, influenced by the new Enlightenment ideals of nature, simplicity, and personal well-being. The public squalor of Versailles, which the French nobility had come to accept as normal, was deeply offensive to her. You walk through her private apartments in the Château. They are a testament to this new sensibility. You find her bathroom, and it is a marvel. It is a room dedicated to the act of bathing. In the center is a beautiful, copper-lined bathtub, encased in carved wood. There are pipes, real, functional pipes that could deliver both hot and cold running water, a luxury almost unheard of at the time. This was not a place for a rare, doctor-ordered medicinal bath. This was a room for regular, leisurely bathing for pleasure and cleanliness. Marie Antoinette loved to bathe, sometimes spending hours in her tub, a habit that was seen as both eccentric and vaguely scandalous by the more old-fashioned members of the court. You explore further and find her private bedroom. It is a vision of simple elegance. And next to it, you find a small, discreet room. Inside is a water closet. Not a clunky, unreliable prototype like the king's, but a more refined, functional English model. And here, in this smaller, more rationally designed building, the engineers had been more successful. The plumbing actually worked. The toilet flushed to a dedicated, well-maintained cesspit located a safe distance from the house. It was a private, clean, and odorless space. This was revolutionary. The Queen was not just demanding luxury, she was demanding privacy and cleanliness in a way that fundamentally challenged the core principles of Versailles. Remember, the entire system of the main palace was built on the eradication of privacy. Power was proximity. The king's body was public property. To demand a private bathroom, to close and lock the door, to perform a biological function without an audience of high-ranking nobles, was a quiet but profound act of rebellion. It was a declaration that one's body was one's own, not an instrument of the state. The why behind this shift is the story of a changing worldview. Marie Antoinette and her circle were moving away from the miasma theory and embracing a new, almost modern, concept of sensibility. This new philosophy valued personal feeling, refined senses, and an appreciation for the natural world. In this worldview, foul smells and visible dirt were not just dangerous, they were aesthetically offensive. They were an assault on one's delicate sensibilities. Cleanliness was becoming a marker not just of health, but of a refined and superior character. A clean body, a clean house and clean air were the new symbols of elite status. This new obsession with cleanliness is visible everywhere in her private world. The fabrics she chose were lighter in colour, whites and pastels, and made of cotton, which, unlike the heavy silks and velvets of the main court, could be and was regularly washed. Her personal style gravitated towards simpler dresses, the famous chemist Lorraine, which looked to her critics like scandalously simple undergarments. She was rejecting the heavy, pest-infested costumes of the old guard in favour of something light, airy, and clean. This desire for a clean, private, and natural world reached its zenith in her creation of the Hameau de Lorraine, the Queen's Hamlet. A short walk from the Petit Trianon, she had a completely artificial, storybook peasant village built around a lake. It had a working farm, a dairy, a mill, and several charming, rustic-looking cottages. Here, the Queen and her closest friends would dress up as milkmaids and shepherdesses and engage in a fantasy of simple, rural life. The illusion of the hamlet is one of authentic, rustic simplicity. The reality, of course, was that it was another elaborate and incredibly expensive stage set. The peasant cottages were exquisitely decorated inside. The farm animals were washed and groomed daily. The dairy, where the Queen would pretend to churn butter, had milk pans made of pristine porcelain. It was a sanitized, perfumed version of peasant life, with all of the charm and none of the dirt, poverty, or hardship. But even in this fantasy, the underlying principle was a rejection of the world of the main palace. She was trying to escape the filth, both literal and political, of Versailles. She was building a world where the air was clean, the water was pure, and the complexities of court life were replaced by the simple, supposedly clean tasks of the countryside. Her desire for a private, clean room was expanding into a desire for an entire private, clean world. The tragic irony is that this very escape became one of the primary weapons used against her. To the starving population of Paris, the stories of the Queen's Hamlet were not seen as a search for a purer lifestyle. They were seen as the ultimate insult. While they lived in genuine squalor and struggled to afford bread, the Queen was spending a fortune to build a fake, picturesque farm to play in. Her desire for cleanliness was misinterpreted as a decadent, out-of-touch fantasy, a rejection of the filthy. Public life of the court was seen as a rejection of her duties as Queen of France. The shift had begun. Marie Antoinette's personal quest for a clean and private space marked the beginning of the end for the culture of public squalor that had defined Versailles for a century. Her modern sensibilities were a harbinger of the 19th century obsession with sanitation, privacy, and domestic comfort. But her revolution was a personal one, not a public one. She built a clean bubble for herself, while the palace and the kingdom continued to rot from its foundations. The change she represented was too little, too late, and too private to save the monarchy. The great, stinking, magnificent ship of Versailles was already sinking, and her clean, well-appointed lifeboat would ultimately be swamped by the same revolutionary tide that would consume the old world entirely. The desire for a clean room, it turned out, was a revolutionary act, but the real revolution would be far larger and far bloodier than simply installing a working toilet. The journey through the filth of Versailles ends here, not with a grand cleaning, but with a quiet, personal preference for a bath and a locked door. It is a reminder that the greatest changes in history often begin not with grand pronouncements, but with a simple human desire for something better, something cleaner, something more private-y desire that, in a world built on public performance and systemic filth, was the most radical idea of all. And so, my dear friend, our long walk through the gilded, grimy halls of Versailles comes to a close. We have peered behind the velvet curtains and lifted the silken bedclothes to find a world far stranger and far more pungent than the history books usually suggest. We've seen how an entire society, at the very peak of its power and artistic achievement, could live so intimately with a level of filth that is almost beyond our modern comprehension. We saw that the stench was not a simple accident of poor planning, but a complex symptom of a worldview, a tool of political control, and a constant, unavoidable presence in the lives of everyone, from the Sun King in his velvet commode to the lowliest servant sleeping in a sweltering attic. The great palace, which still stands as a monument to glory, now stands in our minds as a monument to a paradox, a place where breathtaking beauty was built upon a foundation of breathtaking squalor. As you begin to drift now, let these vivid images soften and fade. Let the unsettling sense of the past be replaced by the gentle, clean air of your own quiet room. The journey is over. The secrets have been told. There is nothing left to do now but to rest in the comfort and the quiet of the present moment. Let your thoughts become slow and gentle, like dust motes dancing in a final ray of sunlight, and allow yourself to sink deeply and peacefully into the soft, welcoming darkness. Sweet dreams.